I have always felt a strange pull towards things that are not quite normal. When I was a teenager, I spent a lot of my time writing poetry that was unsettling, full of dark thoughts and strange images. I was never one to have many friends. I was more of a person who had one very close friend or no friends at all. That is just how I have always been. My parents divorced when I was still very young, and because of that, I often felt sad. I spent a lot of time by myself. My mother and I moved into a small house that was very close to my grandparents' place. It was so close, in fact, that you barely had to walk a few steps to get from our front door to theirs. My mother often went over to my grandparents' house, spending hours with them, finding comfort in their presence. But I preferred to be alone in our small new house. I liked the quiet. One particular night I was sleeping in my room, completely in the dark. I dreamed that there was a man, his face a deep, unsettling black, sitting right on the edge of my bed. He was just staring at me. His gaze felt heavy, and I could feel it even in my sleep. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding, filled with that terrible, certain feeling that someone else was in the room with me. The feeling was so strong, so real, that I snapped out of bed. I fumbled for the light switch, flicked it on, and then ran as fast as I could out of that house and straight to my grandparents' door. I went inside and sat down next to my grandmother, my breath still coming in ragged gasps. "That house," I managed to say, "it can be so creepy." She looked at me, her expression casual, as if I had just commented on the weather. "Oh, of course it can be," she said, and then added without any change in her tone, "2 men died there from breathing in gas while they were renting the place. We found them about a week later." She said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, like it was an everyday piece of information. It hit me like a cold slap to the face. The casualness of her words made the truth of them even more unsettling. That, however, was only a small taste of what was to come. It was merely a warm-up for the strange and frightening things that would happen later in my life. As I grew older, my mother remarried. My grandfather, perhaps needing a change or more space, moved to another one of his properties. This new house was about 150 meters away from the old one, the one I'd been living in. This meant I was left behind, to live by myself in the old house, which had once been my grandfather's home. It was a big house, quite old, and had a naturally unsettling atmosphere. I lived there alone for a year and a half. Even though my family's new house was not too far, it still felt like I was completely isolated in that old place. During that time, I started to see things. I would catch glimpses of what I could only describe as shadowy figures. They were never fully formed, just dark shapes moving at the edge of my vision. I remember distinctly trying to avoid most areas in the house. My daily life was confined mostly to the living room, the kitchen, and the bathroom. The reason for this self-imposed limitation was simple. I constantly felt as though I was being watched. It was a persistent, chilling sensation that made every corner of the house feel hostile. I was a student then, working on my graduation project, so I did not leave the house much, only venturing out for necessary things like groceries. This isolation, combined with the feeling of being observed, slowly started to wear me down. There were 2 long hallways in that house. One led to the bathroom, which I used daily, but even then I would rush through it. The second hallway led to what used to be my grandparents' bedroom. It was a very large room, and it was always kept locked. My grandparents used it to store many of their old belongings. When you stood at the beginning of that hallway, you could not even see the door at the very end of it. It was so dark, stretching into what felt like an endless tunnel of shadow. I avoided that area at all costs. You just start to feel it, that deep, unsettling sensation, when something is truly wrong. And in that hallway, something was profoundly wrong. Late at night, often between 2 and 3 in the morning, I would hear loud, jarring sounds coming from the door. It was as if someone was repeatedly hitting it. I would try to brush it off, to tell myself it was just the old house settling or the wind. I would try to act courageous because what else could I do? I had no choice but to stay in that house. I literally had nowhere else to live. So, every night, I would make sure the door to the living room was securely locked. The lock on that door was old and did not feel very strong, so I would always wedge a heavy chair against it as an extra measure, a physical barrier against whatever might be trying to get in. Then I would turn on the television, hoping the noise and light would provide some comfort, and try desperately to fall asleep. One night, I felt particularly unwell. I woke up burning with a high fever, my head throbbing, almost drifting into a state of hallucination. It was in that hazy, vulnerable state that I heard it, the chair moving. The scrape of wood against the floor was unmistakable. My eyes snapped open, wide with a sudden, icy fear that cut through the haze of my fever. That is when I saw it, a small, dark, shadowy figure. It was partially visible, just barely, peeking around the slightly open door, looking directly at me. I could not believe my eyes. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. I lurched up from the bed, my body aching with the fever, and stumbled towards the light switch. I flipped it on, flooding the room with a harsh, revealing light. I looked back at the door. The chair, my only defense, had been pushed out of its place, allowing the door to open slightly, just enough for something to have slipped through or peered in. The sight of it, the reality of what I had seen, overwhelmed me. I started to cry, a helpless, desperate sound. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, and called my parents. Neither of them answered. To be fair, it was around 3 a.m, a time when most people are deep in sleep. I felt utterly alone. I prayed, desperately trying to calm myself, trying to convince my shaking mind that it had all been a trick of my fever, a mere hallucination born of illness and fear. 2 months later, I was watching videos on my computer, the sound turned up loud through the speakers. I was watching a video about creatures known as jinns. For those unfamiliar, jinns are entities in Islamic religion, often considered similar to what some might call demons or spirits. The video was titled 30 Facts You Did Not Know About Jinns. The very last fact, delivered in a quiet, unsettling voice, stated that jinns live among us, and that one of them could very well be watching you at that very moment. I chuckled, a nervous, false bravado in my voice. "I am not scared," I said out loud to the empty room. But deep down, I knew I would regret that moment of defiance later that very night. That same night, a few hours later, I decided to play some recitations from the Quran on loop. In my religion, it is believed that such readings can help keep away shadow people and jinns. I hoped it would bring me some peace. I swear to you, at exactly 2 a.m, I woke up, and there they were, 3 shadowy figures. They were not just standing, they were dancing, their forms wavering and twisting in the dim light of my room. One figure was positioned near my feet, another near my head, and the third was standing directly over my face, its form elongated and dark. All 3 of them were making a strange noise. It was not a voice, not a whisper, but something akin to static, a low, grating hiss that was incredibly annoying and deeply unsettling. I screamed at the top of my lungs, a raw, primal sound born of terror and frustration. "Leave me alone!" I shrieked, my voice cracking. As soon as the words left my mouth, they were gone. The room was calm again, the eerie static silence, but the experience shattered something within me. Soon after that night, I began to suffer from severe sleeplessness. I simply could not sleep at night anymore. I would spend the entire night studying, trying to finish my project, cooking meals, watching television, or playing video games. I would only finally drift off to sleep around 6 a.m, when the first rays of daylight began to peek through my windows, offering a fragile sense of safety. One morning, after a long, restless night, I finally fell asleep. I began to dream, but this dream was different. It was so incredibly realistic that it did not even feel like a dream at all. And then I started to hear whispers. It was not a gentle, soft whispering. This was violent, a cacophony that sounded like a chorus from a very dark place. The closest I could describe it was the soundtrack from a vision of the underworld, quiet yet deafening, filled with an evil and aggressive quality. The whispers seemed to come from directly inside my ears, always at the same time. Yet the specific words or sounds were always different, shifting and morphing. I knew I was still dreaming, but the urgency felt real. I stood up in the dream, searching for the source of the terrible sound. It seemed to be coming from that creepy locked room at the end of the long dark hallway. The room that had always been closed, that no one ever entered. Perhaps, I thought, even in my dream state, it had become haunted precisely because it had been kept shut for so long. I moved closer, compelled by an invisible force. And then, from the profound darkness within that room, a man emerged. He was bald, shorter than me, but his arms were surprisingly muscular. I could even see the prominent veins bulging beneath his skin. He looked directly at me, his gaze piercing through me right into what felt like my very soul as he walked towards me. In my dream, as he advanced, I instinctively started reciting a prayer, words tumbling out of my mouth in a desperate plea for protection. At the same time, I suddenly heard my cousin's voice screaming from the stairs of the house on my left. "Flee!" she cried, her voice filled with panic. The bald man was directly opposite me to my right, so I started to move, to run, but it was an incredible struggle. It felt as though something unseen was pulling me from the other direction, holding me back, making every step an immense effort. I pushed through the invisible resistance, finally bursting through the open door of the house and out into the open air, gasping for breath. I thought with a chilling certainty that this thing, this entity, was chasing me. It was in my house, and I did not want to go back. It was at that exact moment that I woke up, the violent whispers still echoing in my ear, just as they had started in the dream. After a while, my grandparents came to stay with me for a bit. My grandmother, especially, would always sleep with the light on at night, something I found comforting in my now constant state of unease. One night, I woke up feeling very strange, a peculiar sensation of unreality washing over me. And I swear, there she was, a giant little girl. She was holding something in her left arm, something small and indistinct. But her eyes were what truly held me. They were the wildest eyes I had ever seen, wide and unblinking. And she was grinning at me, a wide, unsettling smile that did not reach her eyes. She stared right through me, and then I saw what she was holding, a tiny, dwarf-like creature. It had a tail, and its skin was a greyish colour. This little creature was staring intently at my grandmother, who was sleeping soundly beside me. I did not know what to do. My mind simply froze. All I could think to do was try to go back to sleep, to ignore them, to wish them away. On another occasion I was sleeping, or at least I thought I was. I was conversing with someone, or something. I initially believed it was just a dream, but when I opened my eyes, they were not there. Yet I was still hearing their voices, still engaging in the conversation. The voices were pressuring me, urging me. "You should let us in," they whispered, their words insidious. "You are done for anyway. Nobody wants you. Your parents left you. We are the only ones that will help you now." Their words twisted my fears, feeding on my deepest insecurities. I was afraid of them. I did not trust them. What were they saying? Why were they trying to break me down? I felt lost, desperate, and completely alone. I opened my eyes properly then and realized I was crying, my face wet with tears, my body a trembling mess. One other night, I had another dream. I was in a very large bedroom, inside what looked like a grand castle. The room was incredibly fancy, decorated with ornate details and rich fabrics. There was an old woman in the room, someone who looked exactly like a witch from a storybook, a perfect stereotype. She appeared to be attending a funeral. She kept asking me to let her in, her voice filled with a simmering anger. For a while in my dream I made fun of her, defying her strange demands. After some time she left, and then another figure took her place. This one was deaf and mute, its presence equally strange, perhaps even more unsettling in its silence. It was a very bizarre dream, one that stayed with me after I woke. Soon after that dream, my grandmother started sleeping in her old bedroom, the one that had been locked at the end of the dark hallway. She began to accuse me of strange things. She claimed I was running around her bed in the middle of the night, throwing objects at her, pulling the covers off her. I had no idea what she was talking about. I was either asleep or trying to sleep. But her fear was real. She once woke up screaming, and when we rushed to her room, we found half of her personal belongings burned beside her bed. There had been candles, but no source of light or fire could have caused such a blaze. The very same night my grandmother left that house, unable to bear it anymore. Time passed quickly after that. I grew up, finished my studies, and started working. I got a job outside of the country, moving to a place in the Middle East. I stayed alone in a room within local housing provided by my job. One morning I woke up at exactly 5 in the morning, my eyes barely open. There was a thick white fog directly in my face. I was completely covered in it, immersed in its strange, dense coldness. I lay there for a while, completely disoriented, watching it. Then slowly, it began to change. The white fog turned completely black, a swirling, inky darkness, and then as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I had no idea what it was, where it came from, or why it had been there. The strange encounters continued to follow me, no matter where I went, a persistent, chilling reminder of the things that had awakened in that old, haunted house. Growing up in the 1960s on Long Island, I cherished my Aunt Elizabeth. She was my father's youngest sister, a dynamic and vibrant woman 12 years his junior and 17 years my elder. Elizabeth was a flight attendant for a major airline, living in a chic apartment in the city. She embodied classic Italian beauty, petite, with exquisite olive skin, piercing green eyes, and jet black hair that framed her face perfectly. She absolutely adored me, and I, in turn, loved the photographs and gifts she brought back from her travels, treasures from distant parts of the country, and sometimes even from Europe. Each trinket, each exotic postcard, felt like a window into a world I yearned to explore, a world of adventure and sophistication. As I grew older, my parents would occasionally allow me the immense privilege of visiting her apartment. Those visits were magical. She and her equally gorgeous and glamorous friends would be there, filling the air with the scent of their cigarettes, the clinking of cocktail glasses, and the vibrant sounds of records spinning on the turntable. They would talk about glamorous adult things, their jobs, their travels, their relationships, and I, merely by being present in the room, felt sophisticated and cool, a tiny, silent observer in their glittering world. I would watch her graceful movements, listen to her melodic voice, and absorb the aura of confidence and charm that radiated from her. She truly was a force, a beacon of possibility in my young life. Then one day, when she was only 30 years old, the unimaginable happened. She called in sick to work, believing she had a simple flu. It turned out to be meningitis, an aggressive, unforgiving illness. Within 2 days, she was gone. Her death plunged our family into a profound, suffocating grief. What followed were some of the saddest events of my entire childhood. I vividly remember 3 times I saw my father cry great, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. One of those times was as he was dressing for her wake, his shoulders heaving, his face contorted in raw anguish. At the wake, Aunt Elizabeth lay in her casket, still beautiful, dressed in her pristine flight attendant uniform. I recall reaching out, touching the soft, cream-colored satin lining her casket. It felt so gentle, so lovely, a stark contrast to the harsh reality of her absence. So many people came to her funeral that day. The close suburban Catholic church was overflowing, people spilling out onto the sidewalk, a testament to how many lives she had touched. The Sunday dinners at my grandparents' house, once lively and filled with laughter, were never the same again. A void had been left that could not be filled. Ironically, despite having an aunt who was a flight attendant during the golden age of air travel, I developed a deep-seated terror of flying. This fear became a significant problem as I grew older, and my work often required frequent air travel. On some of the long-haul flights, my anxiety was so overwhelming that I couldn't cope without the help of an entire bottle of red wine and a strong dose of a sleeping medication. The thought of being suspended thousands of feet above the ground, confined within a metal tube, was utterly paralyzing. A few months ago, I decided that this unhealthy coping mechanism needed to stop. It wasn't sustainable, and it certainly wasn't healthy. So, on my first cross-country flight in a long time, I made a conscious effort to break the cycle. Instead of wine and medication, I took 10 milligrams of melatonin, settled into my seat, and tried my best to calm my racing heart. My anxiety was still palpable, a tight knot in my stomach, but I focused on my breathing, trying to lull myself into sleep. Eventually, to my great relief, I did drift off. What followed was a dream of terrifying intensity. Of course, it was set on the very same flight I was on. The cabin pressure suddenly dropped, a horrifying, sickening lurch, and the plane began plummeting. The terror in the dream was visceral, palpable. Everyone around me was consumed by panic, their faces contorted, their bodies rigid with fear, silent screams trapped in their throats. The plane was falling rapidly, uncontrollably, heading for an inevitable crash into a vast cornfield below. I was about to die, a certainty that filled me with a cold, desperate dread. Amidst this chaos, as the plane continued its terrifying descent, I saw a figure walking calmly down the aisle towards my seat. It was my Aunt Elizabeth. She moved with an almost ethereal grace, her steps steady and purposeful, completely unfazed by the surrounding panic. A small, sly smile played on her lips, as if she were an old friend she hadn't seen in a very long time, and she was simply coming to greet me. She was wearing the exact same flight attendant uniform she had been buried in, a pristine, timeless garment. But strangely, her legs and feet were bare, a detail that struck me as odd even in the dream's disorienting reality. She reached my seat, looked directly at me with eyes full of warmth and understanding, and then gently took my left hand in hers. Her touch felt real, solid, comforting. "It'll be okay, honey," she said, her voice soft and reassuring, a gentle counterpoint to the imagined screams around us. "It really will. Things can look bad and sometimes it gets a little turbulent, but the pilot will right it." Then she looked at me with genuine curiosity and asked, "How are you?" Her question, so simple and ordinary in the midst of extraordinary circumstances, surprised me. I babbled out the first things that came to mind, a torrent of updates on my life since I was 13, the last age she had known me. I spoke about where I had gone to school, something about my first job, trying to give her a snapshot of the decades she had missed. I even mentioned cellular phones, explaining their ubiquity, and how much I thought she would have loved them. I told her that my father had passed away, but that my mother and sister were doing fine. I talked about how ridiculously high rents had become in the city, and all the changes that had happened to our hometown, how it had grown and transformed. As I spoke, the words flowing out in a mix of grief and longing, I began to notice something miraculous happening within the dream. The plane was returning to normal. The cabin pressure was stabilizing, The terrifying lurching ceased, and the other passengers, though still shaken, were gradually calming down, the panic subsiding. The dream began to fade shortly after everything returned to a semblance of normality, with Aunt Elizabeth's gentle hand still resting warmly on my shoulder. I woke up 30 minutes before the plane's actual landing, feeling utterly stunned by the vividness and profound impact of the dream. I hadn't truly thought about Aunt Elizabeth or recalled her in such detail for years. I had a few minutes before we landed, so I immediately called my mother and recounted the entire dream to her, the details still fresh and potent in my mind. I mentioned that I found it particularly strange that in the dream, Aunt Elizabeth had been barefoot while working on the plane. My mother paused on the other end of the line, a long, thoughtful silence. Then she said, her voice soft with a surprising revelation, "Elizabeth was buried barefoot, you know. It was a custom," she explained, "in the small corner of Sicily from which my father's family originated, for women to be laid to rest barefoot. They had adhered to this tradition when burying Aunt Elizabeth, and also my grandmother many years later. I would never have known this, as the lower lid of her casket had been closed during the wake. I am not a particularly religious person, but that detail, that piece of specific unknown information revealed in such an intimate way, made me truly believe that my Aunt Elizabeth had indeed come to visit me, to comfort me during a moment of profound stress and fear. Or perhaps something like her, a piece of her essence had reached out. It was a wonderful and deeply moving realization, like being wrapped in a warm, familiar blanket. Suddenly, a flood of memories of my aunt, memories I hadn't even realized I possessed, came rushing back to me, filling me with a tender nostalgia. I found myself in tears in an airport bathroom, overwhelmed by the experience. I have been through a lot in my life since then. Several difficult moves, periods of unemployment, 2 divorces, losing a house, and then, against all odds, getting one back. I have mourned the loss of cherished friends and family members. Yet for a few precious moments in that dream, I got to see someone I loved dearly and who had loved me unconditionally when I was just a little girl, brimming with excitement for the big world that lay ahead of her. It was a profound gift. I hope you visit again anytime, Aunt Elizabeth. About 10 years ago, my family and I embarked on a trip to Peru, a land steeped in ancient history and breathtaking natural beauty. We explored the majestic ruins of Machu Picchu, captivated by the aura of a civilization long past. During our travels, a family friend, a kind man who had worked in museums and had a deep knowledge of the local culture, wanted to give us something truly special to commemorate our visit. He presented us with 3 small vases, claiming they were 400 years old, acquired from a local artisan in the Pisco region. The vases were crafted from a reddish-brown mud, each with a distinct, ancient-looking face carved into its surface. They felt significant, a tangible link to the rich history we had just witnessed. We brought them back home to Canada, excited by our unique souvenirs. Our initial excitement, however, quickly turned to unease. Almost immediately upon the vases entering our home, a horrific streak of bad luck and accidents began to plague our family. It was as if an invisible, malevolent current had been introduced into our lives, systematically dismantling our stability. My mother, in her early 50s, suddenly developed cataracts, an unusually young age for such an affliction. Her vision grew cloudy, hindering her ability to work and navigate daily life. She underwent multiple surgeries, each bringing with it a wave of anxiety and slow, painful recovery. Simultaneously, my father, a dedicated and hard-working man, lost both of his jobs within weeks of each other. The financial strain was immediate and crushing. The once comfortable atmosphere of our home became thick with stress and worry, dominated by hushed, desperate conversations about money. My brother and I, typically healthy, found ourselves constantly sick. It wasn't anything specific, just a relentless cycle of colds, fevers, and unexplained fatigue that seemed to sap our energy and spirits. We missed school, appointments, and general life as our bodies continually fought off unseen ailments. Then there was my little sister. She was only small, and she began screaming randomly, often in the middle of the night, her cries piercing the tense silence of the house. There was no apparent trigger, no nightmare she could recall, just raw, unadulterated terror. We took her to doctors, desperate for an explanation, but they found nothing. Her screams became a chilling soundtrack to our growing despair. The situation spiraled downwards. We were on the verge of being homeless, desperate to find anything of value to sell, to keep a roof over our heads. It was then, in our frantic search, that we came across the 3 mud vases. We had no idea if they were worth anything or even if they could be sold. To get an idea of their potential value, my dad decided to call his friend in Peru, the museum worker who had originally given them to us. After a bit of back and forth, my dad explained our predicament, the string of misfortunes that had befallen us since bringing the vases home. There was a pause on the line, a shift in the friend's tone. He then told my dad something that chilled us to the bone. These types of items, he explained, were not meant to leave their home soil. They were intrinsically tied to the land they came from. He said they were not worth more than a few bucks, certainly not as antiques. He then added, his voice hushed, that they were probably cursed. To lift the curse, he instructed, we would need to prick our fingers, smear a small amount of our blood on each vase, and then send them back to Peru. The suggestion was met with immediate skepticism, a blood sacrifice. It sounded utterly ridiculous. We were pragmatic people, and our first thought was that the man simply wanted the vases for himself, perhaps to sell them on his own. We dismissed it as superstitious nonsense, a desperate measure for desperate times. The idea of deliberately drawing our own blood and marking these objects seemed outlandish, almost primal. Just 2 days later, the universe delivered a brutal, undeniable retort. My mother and father were involved in a particularly nasty car accident. They were fortunate to be alive, and their injuries were not life-threatening, but both sustained significant trauma that required them to be off work for several weeks. The financial situation, already dire, now plunged into absolute catastrophe. Lying in the hospital, recovering, their minds still reeling from the crash, they looked at each other. The coincidence was too stark, too terrifying to ignore. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Peruvian friend had been right. Perhaps this was a direct consequence of defying an ancient, unseen force. They both decided, with a shared, desperate resolve, that we should send the vases back and perform the blood ritual. The atmosphere in the house shifted from despair to a grim determination. We gathered the vases, the air thick with apprehension. Each of us, one by one, took a needle and pricked a finger, watching as a tiny bead of our own blood welled up. With a mixture of fear and reluctant hope, we carefully smeared a small amount of blood onto the surface of each mud vase, marking the ancient faces with our offering. The act itself felt bizarre, an uncomfortable blend of ancient superstition and modern desperation. We packaged them securely, addressed them to the friend in Peru, and sent them off. The change was almost instantaneous. The very next week after the vases were mailed, things in our lives began to improve, noticeably and dramatically. My father, who had been unable to find any work, suddenly received an offer for a very good job, a position with stability and decent pay. My mother too, despite her recent accident, found unexpected employment that allowed her to contribute to our recovery. We were also incredibly fortunate to find a really good place to live, a spacious apartment with surprisingly low rent, a true godsend in our circumstances. And as if by magic, our health began to rebound. The constant sickness that had plagued my brother and me simply receded, and my little sister's random screaming episodes ceased entirely. She slept peacefully through the night, and the tension that had gripped our family for months finally began to dissipate. Looking back, the question lingers. Was it all a coincidence? A mere statistical anomaly of bad luck followed by good? Or were the vases truly cursed, ancient artifacts demanding their return to their homeland, their power manifesting in the misfortunes that befell us? My rational mind searches for logical explanations, but the precise timing, the dramatic shift in our fortunes, remains deeply unsettling. We had gone from the brink of destitution and ill health to a state of unexpected prosperity and well-being, all within weeks of returning those mud figures. The experience left an indelible mark on my family, a quiet understanding that some forces in the world exist beyond our comprehension, operating on ancient principles we may never fully grasp. Perhaps sometimes the simplest explanation, however unbelievable, holds the most truth. My boys, currently 8 and 6 years old, were much younger when this story begins, around 4 and 2. We'd been living in our new house for about 5 or 6 months, still settling into the rhythms of a different place. My oldest son, bless his heart, was still quite young, and to be honest, not always firing on all cylinders in terms of clear communication. He was still in a phase where a lot of his speech was babbling, charming, but often indecipherable, a pattern that continued until he was almost 6. It started subtly. My oldest would frequently walk to a specific corner of the living room, a corner that seemed ordinary enough to me, and simply look up. Then he would begin to talk, his voice a stream of his usual toddler babbling, punctuated by giggles and smiles. I initially paid it little mind, assuming he was engaged in some imaginary play, as small children often are. But after a few times it became more pronounced. He would go to the corner, and then, with the determined seriousness of a small child on a mission, he would take his younger brother by the hand, lead him to the exact same spot, and both of them would look up. Then they would both begin to talk, not just babble, but a soft, conversational stream of sounds, their faces alight with smiles and giggles, as if an adult, an unseen friend, was actively interacting with them. It was a sweet, yet slightly uncanny sight. One afternoon, after my youngest had toddled over and stumbled, I finally decided to intervene. "What in the world are you two doing?" I asked, assuming it was some kind of elaborate game. My oldest, still beaming, giggled and said, with perfect clarity, "I'm talking to Grandpa." I paused, confused. My own grandpa, my children's great-grandpa, lived far away in Nebraska. He was a distant, beloved figure, not someone they would realistically be talking to in a corner of our living room. "Grandpa," I replied, trying to make sense of it. "Your grandpa lives in Nebraska, honey. He's very far away." My child looked at me with an expression of pure innocence, utterly convinced of what he was saying. "No, Mummy," he replied, his voice clear and coherent, a startling contrast to his usual babbling. "It's your grandpa." His words hit me with a profound jolt. For him to suddenly speak so clearly, to articulate a complete and coherent thought about my deceased grandfather, was deeply unnerving. I looked at the corner, watching both my boys as they continued their soft chatter, holding up toys as if presenting them to an unseen recipient. I stood there for a few minutes, completely captivated, observing this strange, silent interaction unfold before my eyes. This entire scene, from the initial question to the final moment, had transpired over a span of about half an hour. Eventually, I called out to them, "Babies, come watch your movie so Mom can finish dinner." Small children, after all, operate on zero logic when it comes to playtime. The younger one obediently waddled over and sat down. The eldest, with a thoughtful air, picked up the toys that had accumulated in the corner, carefully put them away, and then joined his brother on the sofa. I turned my attention to dinner preparations, but my gaze kept drifting back to that specific corner, a new sense of awareness lingering there. Just as I thought about the interaction again, a silent, internal thought. Thanks, Grandpa. The door to a small, seldom-used cabinet that was part of the corner structure, a door that had been securely latched, inexplicably fell open. It opened inwards, softly, as if someone had simply walked right through it. A heightened, almost electric feeling filled the room afterwards, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. That night, my sleep was profound, yet it brought with it a dream of startling clarity and emotional depth. I found myself in my childhood home, a place brimming with distant, tender memories. I was walking along the familiar path that led back to the woods, a path I had traversed countless times as a child. There, nestled amidst the trees, was a small, unfamiliar building. It was constructed of granite reminiscent of a mausoleum, but it was much simpler, little more than an awning supported by 4 pillars, a single wall, that held a closed door, and surprisingly, a sturdy bench swing hanging beneath the awning. I walked towards it, a strange sense of anticipation guiding me. Once inside, I found a small stick of incense, and with a quiet reverence lit it, the thin wisp of smoke curling upwards. I then sat on the bench swing, allowing myself to rock gently, my gaze fixed on the ground beneath my feet. And then they appeared. Those old, familiar, ratty sneakers, worn from years of use, slid into view. My grandpa was sitting right next to me on the swing, his presence warm and comforting. That familiar, gentle smile was on his face, the one that always put me at ease. I didn't hold back. I just started talking, mostly about the boys, how much they had grown, their personalities, the funny things they did. I told him how much I missed him, a deep ache in my chest that had never truly healed. I confessed that I had named my oldest son after him, a tribute to his memory. He simply sat there, listening intently, his smile unchanging, a silent, loving presence. After a while, we both stood up. I reached out, and he enveloped me in a warm hug, a feeling so real, so tangible, that I could almost feel the fabric of his shirt against my cheek. I whispered to him, "I haven't told you everything yet," a sense of urgency in my voice, as if there was so much more to share, so much more time I wanted. But then my name was called. It came from somewhere indistinct, a disembodied voice that seemed to pull me away. I looked around, searching for the source, but saw no one. When I looked back, he was gone. The space next to me on the swing was empty. A profound sense of loss washed over me. In my dream, in a desperate attempt to reconnect, I yanked open the door on the granite building. Instead of a room, it opened into a vertical shaft, endless in both directions, completely lined with countless doors, stretching into an infinite abyss. The sight was disorienting, overwhelming, a sudden shift from comfort to a chilling unknown. I woke up abruptly, the dream's final image still searing in my mind amidst a full-blown panic attack, my heart pounding, tears streaming down my face. My grandfather had passed away in 2005, my grandmother in 2008. My oldest son, whom I named after my grandfather, was born in 2010, just 1 week shy of my grandfather's birthday. And in a strange twist of fate, his birth had been originally scheduled to be induced on my grandfather's actual birthday. The timing of these events, culminating in the dream and the boys' interactions, felt like more than mere coincidence. It felt like a gentle, loving connection reaching across the boundary of life and death, a quiet comfort from a presence I cherished, confirming that some bonds truly transcend all limits. When my sister was quite young, our grandmother bought her a porcelain doll. It wasn't anything particularly special, certainly not an antique or a collector's item. It was the kind you might find in a novelty shop, designed more for display than for play. The doll had a delicate porcelain head, hands and feet, with a soft cloth body underneath its pretty dress. It came with a small wooden stand and was quite fragile, meant to be admired from afar. Moving it without extreme care ran the risk of breaking its delicate parts. My sister had this doll for a few years, a quiet ornament in her bedroom, before the tumultuous period of my parents' divorce. After the divorce, our lives shifted dramatically. We moved with our mother to a poor neighborhood in Alton, Illinois. The new house itself was old and felt strange from the moment we stepped inside. There was a particular persistent, musty smell that seemed to cling to everything, a scent of neglect and something indefinable, almost melancholic. It wasn't just the smell. The house seemed to possess an odd silence, a peculiar atmosphere that made me feel uneasy. My sister, perhaps sensing the same strangeness, placed her porcelain doll in one of the built-in cabinets in the wall of our new living room, almost as if putting it away for safekeeping. That's where it stayed for the first few days, an inert figure behind glass. At first, we started noticing small, subtle changes. The doll, which had been placed facing towards the wall or a corner, would suddenly be rotated, now facing directly into the living room. Or if it was facing the living room, we would leave the room for a moment and return to find it angled differently, a slight, almost imperceptible shift. We initially brushed it off, looking at each other with knowing glances, certain our mother was messing with us, playing a silly trick to lighten the mood in our new, strange home. We largely ignored it, but the occurrences persisted, growing more frequent and undeniable. After a few more months, the doll began appearing in entirely different places in the house. It would be on the cabinet, then upon our return from another room, we would find it sitting squarely on the dining room table. Or it would be on one side of the table in the living room, only to appear on the floor facing the television. These were not slight rotations. These were full, purposeful movements across rooms. Our initial theory about our mother quickly dissolved. Mum was often at work during these times, especially during the day, and my sister and I, being typical kids, skipped school plenty of times, spending entire days alone in the house. There was no one else who could have been moving the doll. We started making new friends in the neighborhood, and as kids do, we found a strange thrill in the inexplicable. When they came over, I would proudly, and a little nervously, show them what the doll could do. Without fail, I would place her carefully in a specific spot, usually back in the cabinet or on a table, and we would leave the room for a few minutes. Upon our return, the doll would invariably be in a different location, almost as if performing on cue. Our friends, wide-eyed and a little spooked, would confirm that it was indeed moving on its own. One day, curiosity pushed us further. I had an old Ouija board in my closet, its dusty surface a forgotten novelty. We decided to mess with it. We set it up, the planchette cold beneath our fingertips, and began asking questions. The messages that came back, spelled out slowly, identified a spirit named Candy Zimmerman. She didn't say much. Her responses were brief and cryptic, but I, for some reason, felt a peculiar connection to her through the board. She even spelled out that she had a crush on me, a detail that was both unsettling and strangely flattering to a young, impressionable mind. Then came the day that cemented the doll's terrifying power in my memory. I'd skipped school again, a common occurrence then, but my sister had gone. My routine for skipping was always the same. I would walk with my buddy down to the bus stop, hang out with him for a while, and then head back home after watching my sister get on the bus. My mum worked early, so she was already gone. I returned to the house, locked the front door securely, and since I was still tired, I opted to go back to bed, settling into the quiet comfort of my room. The next thing that happened, I will truly never forget. I heard a knock at my bedroom door. It was faint, but distinct enough to startle me awake. I lay there, eyes open, listening, but nothing else came. I dismissed it, convinced it was merely the old house settling, and laid my head back down on the pillow. After a few minutes, another knock came. This one was much louder, more forceful, and it followed a very specific, memorable rhythm. It was similar to the shave and a haircut tune, but distinctly different, a pattern that seemed deliberate and unsettling. By now, I was truly freaked out. I lay there, rigid, my eyes wide open in the darkness, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. The door to my bedroom was old and heavy, and in the warmer weather, which it certainly was that day, it always stuck, requiring a firm pull to open. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, the door popped open. It opened just enough for me to see a sliver of the hallway floor outside, but not enough for me to see over the edge of my bed. I cautiously sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and looked down onto the floor. And there, standing perfectly upright at the very entrance to my room, was that porcelain doll on its stand, its painted eyes staring directly at me. Before the full wave of terror could set in, a surge of annoyance and anger washed over me. Had my sister somehow come back? Was she messing with me, playing a cruel prank? I got up, my movements stiff, and in a moment of indignant frustration, I took the doll by its hair, lifted it from its stand, and carried her out into the living room. "Okay, very funny," I muttered, expecting to find my sister hiding, ready to jump out. But no one was there. The living room was empty, silent. I rushed to the front door, pulling on the knob to check it. It was locked, just as I had left it. A growing knot of dread began to form in my stomach. I barged into my sister's room, expecting to find her empty. I burst into my mum's room. No one was home. At this point, the initial anger drained away, replaced by a cold, pure fear. I was truly freaking out. I went back to my sister's room, the doll still clutched in my hand. I opened her closet door, a large, deep space filled with old bags of clothes and boxes of junk. In a desperate, almost violent act, I threw the doll into the closet, pushing it deep into a stack of old clothes, burying it under bags and boxes, desperate to make it disappear to contain whatever malevolent presence it carried. I slammed the closet door shut, the sound echoing in the silent house, and then spent the rest of the day sitting on the front porch, huddled in the sunlight, waiting anxiously for my mum to come home. The doll never appeared again after that. I also made sure to have a friend who practiced Wiccan rituals bind the Ouija board, a task she took seriously and eventually kept the board herself. We moved out of that house a year later, after a few more subtle paranormal incidences that, though less dramatic, maintained the house's unsettling aura. As for the doll itself, after we moved back in with my father, it remained in my bedroom closet, forgotten, for about 5 years. Then, one day, as we were cleaning out the closet, we rediscovered it. Without a second thought, we simply threw her away. Was the doll truly haunted? I honestly don't know. Perhaps it was just that strange old house in Alton, and whatever malevolent entity resided there simply used the doll as a conduit, a convenient object to manipulate and terrify us. But the memory of that day, of the doll standing at my door, remains as vivid and chilling as if it happened yesterday, a stark reminder of the inexplicable forces that sometimes intrude upon our lives. When I was around 10 or 11 years old, I often spent nights at my grandma's house, a comforting tradition that felt like a second home. Her guest bedroom, where I always slept, was a quiet space, filled with antique furniture and the comforting scent of old wood and lavender. Next to the bed, there was a beautiful antique easy chair, upholstered in a faded floral pattern. It was a stately piece, always empty, a silent sentinel in the room. One morning, I woke up with the soft, hazy light of dawn filtering through the curtains. My eyes drifted open, and as they adjusted, I looked over towards the antique chair. Sitting there, poised and still, was a little girl. She had dark hair, meticulously done up in 2 neat pigtails, each tied with a bright blue ribbon. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the style reminiscent of the early 1900s, with delicate lace and small buttons. Initially, I was profoundly startled to see her. My heart gave a surprised lurch. But then, As I continued to look, I realized something else. Something that quieted my fear and replaced it with a strange wonder. I could see through her. The patterns of the chair upholstery were faintly visible through her form, like looking through a pane of slightly distorted glass. She simply looked at me, her face serene, and then a small, gentle smile touched her lips. She raised a small hand and gave a delicate wave, her movement slow and deliberate. Her lips moved, and though no sound reached me, I clearly understood the words she mouthed. Hello. A feeling of profound calm settled over me, replacing my initial shock. Without hesitation, I mouthed hello back, a quiet greeting exchanged between worlds. She held my gaze for another moment, her smile unwavering, and then, as softly as she had appeared, she began to fade. Her form shimmered, became more translucent, and then dissolved completely, leaving the antique chair empty once more. The room was quiet, the sunlight filtering in, and a profound sense of awe settled over me. That was my very first experience with something truly beyond the ordinary, my first encounter with a ghost. Months passed. The memory of the little girl in the guest room remained vivid, a secret wonder I held close. I never spoke of it to anyone, partly because I feared they wouldn't believe me, and partly because it felt like a special private encounter. The longing to see her again lingered in my mind, a quiet hope. Then came Easter Sunday. My sister and I were staying the night at my grandma's house, a cherished tradition, eager to wake up early and discover our Easter baskets and hunt for eggs. I woke up well before anyone else, the pre-dawn quiet of the house a comforting blanket. The excitement of Easter morning was a tangible thing, pulling me from bed. I slipped out quietly, careful not to disturb my sleeping sister, and padded softly to the living room. The early morning sunshine, though still dim, was beginning to stream brightly through the windows, casting long, golden shafts of light across the room. And there she was. The little girl, with her dark pigtails and blue ribbons, was sitting on the couch, perfectly still, bathed in the soft, golden light. A smile spread across my face. It was such a joy to see her again, a feeling of reunion with a familiar, friendly presence. I raised my hand and waved hello, a small, hopeful gesture. She smiled back, her eyes bright, and returned my wave, her movements as gentle and graceful as before. I whispered, "It's great to see you," genuinely pleased by her presence. She nodded emphatically, her whole demeanor conveying that the feeling was mutual. There was a sense of shared understanding, a silent conversation unfolding between us. My grandma, it seemed, must have stirred and heard me talking to someone. Her voice, slightly groggy with sleep, came from the hallway telling me to go back to bed, that it was still far too early to hunt for eggs. Her voice, so utterly normal and mundane, shattered the delicate moment. I looked at my grandmother, then back at the couch. The little girl was gone, vanished instantly, leaving only the sunlit, empty space. That was the last time I ever saw the little girl with the blue ribbons in her hair. My grandma moved from that house shortly after, seeking a new place to live. I wondered, sometimes, what became of the little girl, if she remained in that house. Years later, a friend of mine, Melissa, ended up moving into the very house my grandma had once owned. We were talking one day, and I, hesitantly, asked her if she had ever experienced anything unusual in the house. Her eyes widened, and she described, with a mixture of fear and wonder, seeing a little girl with ribbons in her hair. Her description matched mine perfectly, from the color of the ribbons to the old-fashioned dress. It was a profound confirmation, a realization that my childhood encounters had been real, witnessed by another. The experience of encountering the little girl, though fleeting, had a lasting impact on me. It opened my mind to the possibility of worlds beyond our immediate perception, to the idea that life, in some form, could linger. It was a gentle introduction to the supernatural, not through fear, but through a kind of quiet wonder and an unexpected, ephemeral connection. I often think of her, the silent, smiling girl, a sweet and enigmatic memory from a time when the veil between worlds seemed thin and easily pierced. In the mid-1980s, a significant portion of my childhood was spent on my great-uncle Wilbur's vast cattle ranch. It was a sprawling property in a rural area, far from any major towns, where the landscape stretched out in endless fields and rolling hills. The air always smelled of dry earth and distant pine. During this period, my dad was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, for his military service, leaving my mom, my sister, and me to reside in a small utilitarian trailer parked on Wilbur's land. It was a temporary setup, but for a young girl it felt like a unique, isolated world of our own. On this expansive property, sometime in the mid-80s, Uncle Wilbur had constructed a peculiar two-story building that everyone simply called the Tower. It was an unusual structure, built for a specific purpose known only to him. The top floor featured windows facing in every direction, providing a panoramic view of the surrounding land. The largest of these windows faced directly towards Highway 99, a distant ribbon of asphalt winding through the countryside. Uncle Wilbur had a fascination with that highway. He believed quite genuinely that you could learn much about the world simply by observing the flow of traffic on 99. In the evenings, he would often go up to the tower, turn on a small television he kept there, and keep a watchful eye over his cattle, simultaneously taking in the distant movement of cars. The lower portion of the tower served as a practical storage space, where my family kept our clothes and non-perishable food items. It was a cool, dark space, smelling faintly of dry goods and old wood. One particular night, my mum instructed my sister and me to go down to the bottom of the tower to pick out our breakfast for the next morning. My sister was in the middle of doing something, her attention elsewhere, so I, feeling helpful, offered to go alone and grab breakfast for both of us. I entered the bottom floor of the tower, the air cool and still, and quickly chose a handful of my favorite Pop-Tarts. As I was gathering them, I could faintly hear the television from the top floor. This was a normal sound, and I naturally assumed Uncle Wilbur was up there, engaged in his nightly ritual of observation. As I stepped out of the bottom half of the tower, I glanced up towards the large window on the top floor, expecting to see Uncle Wilbur's familiar silhouette against the dim evening light. The television was indeed on, a soft glow emanating from within, but Uncle Wilbur was not there. Instead, silhouetted against the inner light, was a family. I could clearly make out a mother, a father, a little girl, and a small boy. The sight struck me as immediately strange. Uncle Wilbur rarely had visitors, and certainly not an entire family staying in his viewing tower. What was even more peculiar was that they weren't watching the television at all. Instead, they were sitting perfectly still on the small couch, facing outwards, their gaze fixed intently on the distant Highway 99. All four of them sat with an unnerving, perfect posture, their hands settled primly on their laps. There was no movement, no chatter, just an unsettling stillness. It was a tableau that defied logic, a silent, unblinking vigil. Despite the oddness of the scene, I simply returned to the trailer, my Pop-Tarts in hand, and surprisingly, I didn't say anything to my mum about what I had seen. The image of the family, silent and still, remained imprinted in my mind. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. When Uncle Wilbur was having his morning coffee, I asked him, as casually as I could manage, who his guests were last night. He looked at me with a genuinely confused expression. He hadn't had any guests, he said. Certainly no one matching that description. His confusion was absolute, and it reinforced the unsettling nature of my sighting. Who then were those perfectly still people I'd seen in his tower? The question lingered, an unspoken riddle. A few months passed. The memory of the silent family remained, a peculiar footnote in my experience of the ranch. The routines of life continued, the cattle grazed, and the sun rose and set over the vast property. Then, one evening, I went down to the bottom of the tower again, this time to grab some oatmeal for breakfast the next morning. I went in, found what I needed, and as I was closing the heavy door behind me, my eyes, almost instinctively, drifted upwards. My gaze fell upon the landing that led to the door on the top floor. And there, looking over the landing, was a woman. She was dressed in a white flowing gown, a garment that seemed to ripple and billow despite the complete absence of any wind. And she herself was as white as her dress, her skin an almost luminous pale. Her hair, long and unbound, also seemed to flow and move with the dress, as if caught in a perpetual, gentle current. She looked down at me, her face serene, and a soft smile touched her lips. Then she raised a hand and performed a slow, long, incredibly graceful wave. It was a friendly gesture, gentle and inviting, yet despite this, a profound terror seized me. My blood ran cold, and a shiver traced down my spine. She reminded me, in that moment, of the depictions of banshees I had seen in movies, ethereal and beautiful, yet hinting at a deep, otherworldly sadness or danger. Without a second thought, I bolted. I ran back to the trailer as fast as my legs could carry me, bursting through the door and frantically telling my mum what I had just seen. My mother, seeing the genuine terror in my eyes, didn't hesitate. She immediately exited the trailer and ascended the outside stairs that led up to the tower. She opened the tower door, the sound echoing in the twilight. She called out, looked around, but no one was there. We both knew, with a chilling certainty, that the lady couldn't have gotten down the stairs and out of sight so quickly. The windows of our trailer faced directly towards the stairway, and neither of us had seen anyone descend. The woman had simply vanished. The tower, it became clear, held a reputation. Most of the family friends who visited the ranch knew that it was haunted. My family and I came to believe that it sat on some kind of vortex, a point where the veil between worlds was thin, allowing for such strange occurrences. It was the only explanation that made sense of the repeated, inexplicable sightings. Even though my family no longer lives on that property, the experiences fundamentally changed my perception of reality. I still see spirits from time to time, fleeting figures at the edge of my vision, or a sudden, profound feeling of presence. I've come to call them my visitors. I don't try to communicate with them, nor do they try to directly interact with me. They simply appear, a momentary glimpse into another dimension, and then, as quickly and silently as they come, they are gone, leaving behind only the lingering sense of the vast, unseen world that exists just beyond our ordinary sight. About 10 years ago, my sister was graduating from Binghamton University, a significant milestone for our family. To accommodate our extended Chinese family, who were traveling from various places, we decided to rent a well-priced bed and breakfast for 2 nights. The listing promised 5 bedrooms, which was perfect for our large group. As we pulled up to the address, we found ourselves in front of a sprawling Victorian-era house. From the outside, it exuded a certain antique charm, but stepping inside was like entering a time capsule, a museum dedicated to a bygone era. The interior was completely decked out with Victorian American aesthetics, to an almost overwhelming degree. Every surface seemed to be adorned with trinkets, porcelain figurines, delicate tea sets, and ornate picture frames. The walls were covered in paintings of serious-looking children, their eyes following you from faded canvases, and photographs of even more serious children stared out from dark, heavy frames. Ornate floral wallpaper, its patterns intricate and swirling, covered every wall, creating a busy, claustrophobic effect. And then there were the dolls. Many, many dolls. They were everywhere, on shelves, in alcoves, sitting primly on settees. their glass eyes seeming to watch your every move. When it came time to pick our bedrooms, a quiet but firm consensus emerged among my family. No one, absolutely no one, wanted the room that clearly housed the largest collection of these creepy dolls. There was a collective shudder, a subtle but undeniable shying away. I, on the other hand, considered myself less susceptible to such old-fashioned superstitions. I didn't immediately grasp the full gravity of the situation, the almost palpable sense of unease that emanated from that particular room. So, with a shrug and a casual, "Sure, I'll take the room with the dolls," I inadvertently sealed my fate for the next 2 nights. Little did I know I was walking directly into a situation that would challenge every rational fiber of my being. As midnight approached, despite the excitement of the day and a tiny, energizing bite of baklava followed by a strong espresso earlier in the evening, I found myself thoroughly tired. I was the first of our family to head to bed. I walked into my designated bedroom, and there they were, exactly as described. The dolls. They were neatly arranged, almost theatrically, inside a large glass display case, all of them meticulously positioned to face directly towards the bed. Their fixed, unblinking gazes seemed to bore into me. "Don't be silly," I thought to myself, trying to quell a nascent prickle of unease. "You're a brave trans girl, and they're probably more afraid of you than you are of them, because you're something they've likely never encountered before." I even chuckled quietly at my own absurd internal monologue, a brave attempt to rationalize and dismiss the unsettling presence. Still, a faint, illogical urge for protection made me take out my black, ebony-handled Opinel pocket knife from my bag. I placed it on the nightstand right next to the bed, a small, tangible anchor of security in a room full of unsettling eyes. I watched some streaming videos on my phone for a while, trying to create a bubble of normalcy. Eventually, I turned off the bedside lamp and slid under the covers, immersing myself in the darkness. I could still feel the dolls staring, their presence a weight in the room, but my rational side continued its mantra. "It's all in your head. Just go to sleep." By 3 in the morning, I was in a strange, half-conscious state, drifting in and out of pure unconsciousness. I was in that liminal space between waking and dreaming, where the brain interprets reality in odd ways. Yet, even in this dreamlike state, I was acutely aware of everything going on around me. The dolls, their staring. The thought, cold and clear, pierced through the haze. Were they next to me? A wave of pure, unadulterated fear washed over me. I was terrified to open my eyes. I squeezed them shut, then forced a slow blink, trying to reassure myself. "It's okay," I thought. "I have protection." But the thought of the knife on the nightstand, that small, inadequate defense, brought with it a new, horrifying realization. I didn't dare look at the ebony-handled knife. I was afraid I would see a doll, one of those rigid, unblinking figures, standing right next to it, right next to me. Then, a chilling memory, a fact I had learned somewhere, surfaced in my mind. Statistically, armed victims of assault often have their weapons taken away and used against them. The thought, so cold and logical, brought a fresh wave of terror. My gosh, I thought, a silent scream of dread. I'm going to get stabbed by a doll. And then I heard it, vividly. A playful, childlike voice, clear as a bell despite being internal, whispered, "It would be my heart's desire." The words, so innocent in their delivery yet so profoundly sinister in context, immediately snapped me into full alertness. It was like R2-D2 rebooting after being in low power mode. My awareness went from 0 to 60 in a split second. Adrenaline surged through my veins, hot and chilling at the same time. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears as my senses sharpened, every nerve ending screaming. I lay there utterly rigid, unable to move a single muscle, my eyes wide open in the absolute darkness, until the first faint sliver of sunlight began to pierce through the curtains at around 5 in the morning. Only then, with the reassurance of the approaching dawn, did I finally mercifully fall asleep. When I woke up later that morning, the memory of the night was sharp, horrifyingly real. I dreaded the thought of having to sleep there again for yet another night. The experience had utterly shattered my pretense of fearlessness. That evening before going to bed, I had a new strategy. You know what? I thought. A quiet resolve settling over me. Violence begets violence. I decided to remove the knife, my supposed protection, from the nightstand. I carefully placed my pocket knife deep inside my bag, choosing to face the night undefended by conventional means. I fell asleep without incident, and to my immense relief, slept soundly through the entire night. It was as if the dolls, or whatever presence had inhabited that room, had been appeased by the removal of the perceived threat, or perhaps simply by my acknowledging their presence without attempting to control it. The experience left an indelible mark, a chilling reminder that some things defy simple logic and brave words, requiring a different, more subtle understanding. When I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, my mother worked the graveyard shift at the local hospital. This meant that she would leave in the evening and not return until the early hours of the morning. My younger sister, who was 5 at the time, and I would usually settle down for the night shortly after she left. Our bedtime routine a quiet, shared affair. One particular evening, though, we were still awake, playing in the living room. It was a spacious room, and it housed a truly huge television, a central fixture of our entertainment. We also had 2 remotes for our television set. We had the same type of TV in my older sister's room, and the remotes were interchangeable, meaning either remote could control either television. The remote for the living room TV was lying on the couch within easy reach, but neither of us was holding it. We were engaged in some quiet play, probably building a fort out of cushions or drawing, when suddenly, without warning, the television screen sprang to life. It didn't just turn on silently, it made some weird electronic noises, a brief crackle and hum that made us both jump. Then, the screen resolved into the familiar images and sounds of the 10 o'clock news playing as normal. My sister and I were scared out of our minds. Our eyes met wide with shock. Neither of us had touched the remotes. Neither of us had even been near the couch where the living room remote lay. Our cats were nowhere near the living room. They were, at that moment, likely curled up asleep in another part of the house, certainly not in a position to have accidentally activated the television. My younger sister and I both slept in my older sister's bedroom, a comforting arrangement that made us feel safer at night. In a rush of pure, unadulterated fear, we scrambled from the living room and ran into her room, bursting through the door. My older sister was fast asleep in her bed, completely unaware of our sudden panic. And there, on the dresser across the room from her bed, was the other remote, perfectly still and untouched. This meant there was no logical explanation for the television turning on. No one in the house could have done it. My younger sister and I, trembling, immediately woke our older sister who, despite her grogginess, did her best to comfort us. She listened to our frantic, overlapping explanations, then gently held us close, murmuring soothing words until our racing hearts began to slow. In retrospect, looking back at that moment now as an adult, it doesn't seem like the most terrifying incident. A television turning on by itself, it sounds almost quaint. But to a little kid, to both of us, it was profoundly frightening. The idea that something unseen, something unexplainable, could manipulate the very objects in our home broke through our childish sense of security. It felt like an intrusion, a deliberate act by something that shouldn't be there. That night, despite our older sister's comforting presence, it took me forever to fall asleep. My mind replaying the sudden crackle, the unexpected image of the news anchor, and the chilling realization that we had been utterly alone when it happened. The quiet of the house felt different after that, charged with an unsettling possibility. I've always known, deep down, that the house I grew up in harbored something unseen, something that defied explanation. It wasn't a constant, overt presence, but a subtle undercurrent, a feeling that lingered in certain corners and manifested in fleeting, unnerving moments. As a child, I developed a peculiar habit, a ritual I performed every time I ventured out of my bedroom. Before stepping fully into the hallway, I would carefully poke my head out, then methodically check both ends of the hall. It was a cautious gesture, much like a person checking for oncoming traffic before crossing a dark alley, a subconscious acknowledgement of an unseen danger. One evening, the hour was late and the house was steeped in its typical nocturnal quiet. I performed my ritual, peering first into the void of darkness that was our dining room. It was a large, shadowy space, always felt a little heavier than the rest of the house. Nothing. No movement, no presence, just the oppressive gloom. My gaze then shifted to the other end of the hall towards the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. Standing there in the dim, almost non-existent light filtering in from some distant source was a figure. It was large, a human-like silhouette, but distinctively tinted with a deep, unsettling red. It wasn't a vibrant, glowing red, but a muted, ominous hue, as if stained by an unseen fire. The figure was simply standing there, utterly motionless, doing nothing. Its stillness was the most terrifying aspect, a stark, unblinking presence in the silent house. It was just there, existing, observing, and its very inaction amplified the dread. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light, a shadow? But it had a solidity to it, a form, a presence that felt undeniably real. The bathroom was located directly across the hall from my bedroom, a short, necessary journey that now seemed impossible. I had a very urgent need to go, a mundane human necessity that suddenly felt like a monumental obstacle in the face of the inexplicable. But the sight of that red-tinted figure, its silent, unwavering presence, paralyzed me. A cold, creeping fear began to bloom in my chest, rapidly blossoming into an overwhelming terror. My eyes welled up, and tears began to stream down my face. I couldn't move, couldn't take a single step towards the bathroom. The need to escape, to simply vanish from its sight, became paramount. With a desperate, silent gasp, I quickly pulled my head back into my room, slammed the door shut, and fumbled frantically for the light switch. The sudden flood of artificial light seemed to push back the encroaching shadows, a small, fragile victory against the darkness. I then scrambled onto my bed, pulling the covers over my head, burying myself in the fabric, desperate to hide from whatever lurked outside. I lay there, trembling, for what felt like an eternity, listening intently to the silence, half expecting the red figure to somehow materialize inside my room. I never saw that red figure again, despite the lingering terror, despite the constant anxious glances towards that part of the house. It never reappeared. Over time, I've tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than a trick of my imagination, a vivid hallucination born of a child's fear of the dark. I tell myself it wasn't real, that it was a figment of my mind. But any time I think of it, a cold shiver still traces down my spine, and the unsettling question always returns, was it real, or am I just crazy? The doubt remains, a persistent, chilling whisper that the house held, and perhaps still holds, a secret that defies explanation, a fleeting, red-tinged shadow that reminds me of its undeniable, unsettling presence. Throughout my 36 years, I have experienced a scattered collection of events that defy conventional explanation, what I can only describe as supernatural occurrences. As a child in particular, I endured a recurring sense of harassment that left me profoundly afraid to be in my own room. The fear was so intense that my mother, in a genuine attempt to provide comfort, purchased one of those little red bed tents that was so popular with kids in the 1980s, creating a small enclosed sanctuary within my bed. Later, while serving at sea in the Navy, I also encountered some truly odd situations, inexplicable moments that lingered in my memory long after they occurred. However, over time, I had largely pushed these experiences to the back of my mind, forgotten them almost entirely. I had, in essence, become somewhat of a closed-minded skeptic. Even when peculiar things cropped up in my adult life, oddities that I couldn't explain, I would dismiss them. I rationalized them away as simply being personally unaware of the scientific principles behind whatever I was witnessing. It was a comfortable, logical stance that provided a buffer against the unsettling. Then, about 3 years and a few months ago, a cascade of negative events began to unfold in my life, initiating a kind of downward spiral in my expectations for the future. The Veterans Administration, in a baffling administrative error, accidentally declared me dead. This absurd bureaucratic misstep, combined with other personal setbacks, left me feeling adrift, disconnected from the very system that was supposed to support me. During this tumultuous time, a close friend, who was like a brother to me and whom I had known since I was 6 years old, moved in. His own life was also spiraling downwards, and we found a strange camaraderie in our shared misfortunes. One night, as we sat together, lost in the hazy confusion of our circumstances, we decided to embark on a peculiar quest. We spent hours watching a series of videos on a popular streaming platform, videos that claimed to teach you how to summon various entities, even demons, and how to trade with them for a better future. The idea seemed outlandish, born of desperation and morbid curiosity, but it offered a strange, dark glimmer of hope. I also had 2 young women, relatives of an ex-girlfriend of mine, living with me at the time. They needed to escape an abusive family situation and were staying in my finished basement. The basement was entirely separate from the main house, with its own entrance from outside, essentially acting as their own small apartment. It was a good deal for them, a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old, as they lived rent-free as long as they helped with my son, assisted with cleaning, and cooked 2 meals a week. They had actually been the ones to suggest to my buddy and me that we should explore videos about bargaining with the supernatural, their curiosity perhaps stemming from their own turbulent lives. The videos themselves weren't particularly helpful, a mishmash of vague instructions and dubious claims, but we decided to start easy, with something seemingly innocuous, a game called Charlie. I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but just in case, it involves taking a piece of paper, dividing it into 4 squares, and writing yes and no in opposite corners. One pencil is placed in the center, and another pencil is delicately balanced on top of it. You then ask questions like, "Charlie, is X true?" And the top pencil is supposed to gently spin towards the yes or no answer. We tried this a few times, and to our surprise, we had enough success. The pencil really did seem to move on its own, that my buddy actually recorded a video of it turning and posted it to his social media account. Invigorated by our unexpected success and the tantalizing potential to gain something, some loot from whatever we were making a deal with, we smoked a significant amount of incredibly potent cannabis. Our minds, already swirling with possibilities, became even more expansive as we conceived what would essentially be our trade template. We operated under the assumption that everyone who traded their soul to the devil in the past had done so in a rush, desperate for fame or riches, without truly considering their side of the bargain, or how unbalanced it might be against them. We devised a 30 for 30 trade. I was around 33 years old when we decided on this, and we figured that 30 years of living as a soul enslaved to a malevolent entity after death really wasn't that bad, especially for a trade of 30 years alive as a successful, prosperous human. With this audacious bargain firmly in mind, I deliberately bothered my cat until it became agitated enough to scratch me, drawing a small amount of blood. I then pressed my thumb into the fresh cut and with a grim determination onto the Charlie paper. This act, the mingling of my blood with the paper, I believe, was the true catalyst for the strange, unsettling events that have continued to plague me to this very day. My buddy, raised Christian, staunchly refused to put his own blood on the paper. From that point on, he steadily became less involved in the active participation and more of a bewildered witness as I pushed forward with our bizarre experiment. I don't remember the exact verbatim words I spoke, but essentially, I laid out my deal, my precise expectations, and my offering. I offered up 30 years of service to whatever entity might be listening to begin after my death in exchange for 30 years of wealth and influence during my lifetime. I made it clear I didn't want fame. Fame seemed like far more work than it was worth. I simply wanted to have enough loot, enough financial security and standing to ensure that my 2 sons, who live with me 100% of the time, would be taken care of forever. And for myself, I wanted to live out the rest of my days feeling successful, regardless of how I obtained that prosperity. The pencil, surprisingly, did not spin. The lights in the room did not flicker, nor was there any sudden chilling breeze. There was no dramatic flare. However, my buddy and I both experienced a simultaneous, profound sensation of being watched. It was an unmistakable, heavy feeling of an unseen presence. We both instinctively turned around, our eyes sweeping the room, checking if the girls had come into the house or if one of my sons had woken up. Nothing. We were utterly alone. My buddy eventually settled onto one of the sofas, and I fell asleep on my recliner sofa, right in front of my coffee table, where the bloody Charlie game lay at rest. I slept surprisingly easily despite the lingering unease, that peculiar sensation, as if someone was staring intently at me, almost in the way one might feel watched while in a vulnerable state. When I awoke, I followed my usual morning routine, the previous night's strange activities pushed to the periphery of my mind. I didn't even consciously think about it until I reached for my coffee cup. My buddy was still asleep, a peaceful figure on the sofa. I typically woke up earlier than anyone else in the house. I sat down in the same spot where I had slept, and as I went to place my coffee cup on the table, I noticed something odd. There, on the polished surface of my coffee table, facing directly towards me, was a distinct, strange handprint. Its fingertips were pointed towards the exact spot where I had slept. I was so startled and intrigued by its peculiarity that I actually took a picture of it with my phone. The handprint was noticeably smaller than my own. The fingers were thinner, almost delicate, and the most striking detail was the number of digits. There were only 4. It looked like 3 thumbs and 1 finger. Even stranger, the nails seemed to have left an impression on the table as well. They were pointed, almost claw-like indentations. When I say impressions, I don't mean the wooden table was scarred or damaged. What I mean is that on its dark, smooth surface, it looked precisely as if someone had placed a hot, sweaty, oddly shaped hand there, but not long enough to leave a smudgy, white imprint. That's why the presence of these distinct, claw-like impressions appearing out of nowhere seemed so profoundly odd. And only 1 hand impression was there, not 2, just the single 4-digit hand. I immediately placed my own hand next to the print. My hands were much too large. My buddy's hands were also too big. My youngest son's hands were too small, and my oldest son's hands, too, were entirely too small to match the print. Just then, the girls came up from the basement. Before they could even begin to tell me about their night, I interrupted them, my voice full of urgency. I had them each place their hand next to the impression on the table. Both their hands were too small as well. Then they began to tell me about their night. They claimed that my buddy and I had kept them up almost all night. They had thought we had gotten drunk and were jamming out to 90s rock and metal. Truth be told, that's a perfectly legitimate assumption. My buddy and I do often play loud music, but the night prior, we hadn't had a single drink, and we had actually turned off the videos right after we came across the Charlie game. The only noise had been our excited talking at certain points. The girls, however, insisted there had been a bunch of loud thumping sounds and constant heavy music playing. The 18-year-old in particular swore she thought we had legitimately thrown a party, with even more of our friends joining in. My sons, on the other hand, had heard absolutely nothing. It was all incredibly weird, but at the time, we all sort of dismissed it as merely odd and noteworthy, nothing more. That night, my buddy and I decided to look at some more videos about entities and bargaining with them. We watched one video that chillingly claimed that just by watching it, you were participating in a demonic summoning. As the night wore on, the atmosphere around the house seemed to grow more uneasy. Both my buddy and I were feeling distinctly unnerved, and every creak or settle the old house made seemed unnatural, imbued with a sinister quality. Eventually, we just turned on a comfort show, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and passed out in the same places as the night before. The following morning, the coffee table, which I had since wiped down, erasing the previous print, now bore two of the exact same impressions on it. Both were facing me, just as the one from the previous morning had been. The only noticeable difference was that there were two prints instead of one. And again, the thumbs were in the same place as human thumbs would be. But once more, there were only 4 digits, and those strange pointed claws were directed towards where I had slept. My eldest son, seeing the prints, immediately became worried. He claimed that I was being haunted by the rake from the famous creepypasta. I confessed that creepypastas usually seemed a bit whack to me, so I wasn't familiar with the story at the time. I took some time to watch a few versions explaining it. I wasn't impressed, and it didn't really resonate with me as a sensible answer to what I had been witnessing. Only the claws and the insinuation that something had been watching me seemed to align. The girls claimed to have had another rough night. This time, however, the disturbance wasn't noise coming from upstairs. It was the lights in their basement apartment turning on and off erratically, and the chilling sound of something scratching persistently at their door, as well as at one of the doors that led directly outside into the woods at the edge of my property. We live deep in the woods, on a mountain, with a few acres of land, so the idea of something scratching on the door isn't too far from likely. I've even had bears wander onto my land and near the house, so a scratching sound at the door is certainly not unheard of around here. But the girls insisted this felt different, more deliberate, more sinister. The girls continued having nights of being freaked out by these disturbances. Despite my growing unease, after the 3rd morning of the strange handprints, I had stopped actively being involved with any odd events, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. The girls grew so frightened by the escalating activity that they decided to move upstairs and slept on the other 2 sofas in the living room. So for a time, all 4 adults in the house slept in the living room, while my sons slept in their own rooms. I have my own bedroom, but I just don't like sleeping in beds. I prefer the recliner. The girls continued to have unsettling experiences, even in the upstairs bathroom, reporting the persistent feeling of being watched, and the shower curtain being pulled back when no one else was in the room. My sons, too, began to experience strange things. Both of them woke up one morning with what appeared to be cat scratches on their chests. They seemed superficial enough, but they were deeply spooked because our cats will tolerate anything except being used to dust tables. That's how I got them to scratch me for the original Charlie game. The idea that the cats, usually so gentle with them, would do this in their sleep was disturbing. One night, all 4 of us, my buddy, the 2 girls and I, clearly heard the scratching at the door. This time, it was at the upstairs door, not the basement one. As a combat veteran, I have firearms readily accessible, so my buddy and I decided to step outside and search the immediate area. We kept hearing a rustling sound, a distinct movement in the undergrowth, so we followed it around the edge of the property until we got down by the basement. We both noticed the light was on in the basement. My buddy was the first to notice distinct movement through one of the windows. To prevent air leaks, a few windows in the basement are covered with weatherproof plastic, so we could only make out the shadow of a head moving back and forth inside. Whoever it was, it certainly didn't belong in my basement, and especially not at night time. We came around to the door, which was already opened wide. I yelled into the basement, announcing that we were armed and that by coming forward now, they would be safely escorted from the property, whereas jumping out could lead to them being injured. There was no response, no sound at all from within. But all the lights were on, and the door had been wide open. The majority of my basement is open space with just one finished room save for a missing door. The older girl had stayed there, and she had hung a blanket in place of a door. My buddy was standing right behind me. When I moved the blanket hanging in the doorway, all the lights in the basement simultaneously shut off with a totally audible snap. My buddy, startled, called out, "What is it?" and immediately ran outside. I followed him, my own movements quick. Later he explained that he had been genuinely spooked when I came out. He told me he had run out because he was certain my head had pushed past him in the dark and run out ahead of him. So when he had said, "What is it?" he thought he was talking to me running past him, despite the fact I hadn't moved until he left the basement. I closed the basement door and put a participant block in front of it to secure it. We went back upstairs shaken, but the immediate threat seemed to have receded. My buddy then relayed what happened upstairs. The power had gone out upstairs too, but when the girls had gone to the breaker box, which is upstairs in a broom closet, a weird 70s design choice, the power had come back on without an issue. Perhaps it came back to the basement as well, though I'm unsure whether we noticed it did or not in the chaos. Eventually, the girls moved out. They still keep in touch and visit, but they absolutely refuse to stay overnight anymore because they're afraid of whatever it was that I did. They definitely think I let something loose, that I somehow invoked a malevolent entity. They believe that this entity is essentially angry with me that my deal wasn't weighted in its favor, so it's stuck being a minor annoyance, while I, to cope, make fun of it for not giving me any of my promised loot. I've repeatedly pointed out to them that I received no such bounty as stated in the deal I offered, that my life didn't magically transform into extreme wealth. But they retort, pointing out that just a couple of months after the Charlie game, the VA finally fixed their mistake about my status and began paying me again, rectifying a major financial burden. They also noted that soon after the game, my writing had been noticed, and I'd been making money with that, gaining a smallish following. And perhaps most convincingly, they pointed out that my buddy had sold his house. Yes, he had a house, even though he was living with me, for a life-changing amount of money which he used to travel for a while before eventually coming back to this area. There continue to be odd circumstances around the house. We've seen strange, unexplainable footprints in the snow and mud outside the house, on the patio, and around the cars. We've heard noises in the basement and around the house that defy explanation. Once, the steps to the attic had been pulled down and left open for some reason, despite no one having been near them. I wake up sometimes with inexplicable scratches on my head, arms, or legs, but again, they are superficial, and I don't have any scars from them. At this point, I can't entirely rule out that my cats might scratch me in my sleep, especially if they're used for a dust rag for kicks. The running joke in the house is that Charlie needs to come out of his pockets if he's going to harass the household. My life is certainly on the upturn now, and I'm grateful for that. But I certainly didn't receive the dramatic, overt transformation I was expecting for the offer I made. The girls maintain their theory that I let something loose that is angry with me, that my deal isn't weighted in its favor, so it's stuck being a minor annoyance while I simply mock it for not giving me any of my loot. But I stand by my assessment. 30 for 30 is a fair trade, and it'll need to make more than a trivial paw print to change my mind on that. My parents, always on the lookout for a good investment, decided to purchase an older house with the intention of fixing it up. It was a charming, if somewhat neglected, Victorian-era structure on a quiet street, brimming with potential. They envisioned transforming it into a beautiful home, filled with light and laughter. However, Their enthusiasm was soon tempered by a chilling discovery about the house's past. Apparently, the family who lived there before them was an elderly couple who had a grandson residing with them. One day, tragically, that grandson died. We heard conflicting stories. Some said he was hit by a car right outside the house, others that he succumbed to the flu. The exact cause remained a mystery, but the fact of a young life abruptly ending within its walls or just outside its threshold cast a subtle, somber shadow over the house from the very beginning. My mother, being meticulous, spent many days there painting and preparing the rooms. She would set up her supplies, placing brushes, paint cans, and drop cloths in specific, organized spots. On one occasion, she was painting a wall, and she laid her paintbrush down on a specific part of the drop cloth, clearly remembering its exact position. She left the room for a moment, perhaps to grab a drink or answer a phone call. When she returned, the paintbrush was no longer where she had left it. It was several feet away, in a completely different spot, as if someone had deliberately picked it up and moved it. My mother initially dismissed it as her own absent-mindedness, a momentary lapse of memory. But the feeling that she had been utterly certain of its placement lingered, a small, unsettling seed of doubt. My aunt and uncle, ever supportive, would often come over to help with the renovations on various days. One afternoon, my aunt was there by herself, tackling some of the cleaning and prep work. She was nearing the end of her day and was about to leave when distinctly she heard the sound of water turning on upstairs. It was the rush of a faucet opening, a clear and unmistakable sound in the otherwise quiet house. Annoyed by the interruption to her departure, she sighed and went upstairs to turn it off, assuming it was a faulty pipe or perhaps something she had accidentally bumped earlier. She turned the faucet off, ensuring it was completely closed, and then walked back downstairs, ready to leave. Just as she reached the bottom step, the distinct sound of running water began again, precisely as it had before, coming from the same upstairs location. A profound, icy dread washed over her. She knew with absolute certainty that she was alone in the house, and that no human hand could have turned that faucet back on. Without a moment's hesitation, she freaked out, abandoning her tasks, and fled the house, her heart pounding. Finally, there was my uncle's experience. He was alone in the house one evening, finishing up some electrical work, and was preparing to leave for the night. He was in the living room, gathering his tools, when his attention was drawn upwards. At the top of the stairs, a light switch, operated by a long chain that hung down, began to sway. It wasn't a gentle sway from an unseen draft. It began to dangle, swaying back and forth with a deliberate rhythmic motion, as if an invisible hand was pulling on the chain, playing with it. There was no open window, no source of wind. The movement was undeniable, yet entirely inexplicable. My uncle, a pragmatic and level-headed man, felt a prickle of unease turn into a full-blown sense of something profoundly wrong. He left pretty quickly after that, abandoning his tools for the moment. The image of the dangling chain burned into his mind. These incidents, small and seemingly isolated, began to build a cumulative atmosphere of unease around the house. My parents, while never explicitly saying the house was haunted, started to approach their renovations with a new caution, a quiet acknowledgement that they weren't entirely alone in their project. The house, which had promised so much, now seemed to whisper tales of its past, of an unseen presence that lingered, playful yet unsettling. The feeling of being watched, of objects subtly manipulated, became part of the house's very fabric, a constant low-level hum of the inexplicable. It made the entire venture, what was supposed to be a dream project, tinged with a persistent, chilling question mark. 13. The staircase apparition. From around the age of 12 to 14, I lived in a particular house where a number of unexplainable things seemed to occur. Small, subtle oddities would happen, like cupcakes inexplicably toppling over on the kitchen counter, or chairs subtly shifting their positions in the dining room when no one was around. These were minor incidents, easily dismissed as an old house settling or a trick of the light. But they contributed to a quiet sense that the house possessed a life of its own. However, there is one specific memory from that period that stands out. One that, even now, gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. It was a chilling encounter that remains vividly imprinted on my mind. I shared a bedroom with my twin sister at the time. Our room was small, dominated by a set of sturdy bunk beds, and I always slept on the top bunk. It gave me a certain vantage point, a slightly elevated perspective of our shared space. One night I woke up abruptly at around 3:30 in the morning. The house was enveloped in a profound, absolute silence, the kind that feels heavier than sound itself. As I lay there, trying to ease myself back into sleep, the silence was suddenly broken. From the very bottom of the stairs, a distinct creak echoed through the house. It was an old house, full of the sounds of aging wood and settling foundations, so my immediate thought was that it was just the house being old, a common occurrence in our well-worn home. But then the sound began to move. Slowly, deliberately, another creak, then another, making its way up the stairs. Each sound was distinct, measured, conveying the clear impression of something heavy, something with a purpose, ascending each wooden step. The sound was incredibly chilling, a slow, methodical progression that filled the oppressive silence of the early morning. My bed faced our bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, providing a narrow view into the hallway, but not directly onto the stairs themselves. So as the sounds continued their ascent, I could only lie there, utterly frozen in fear, my eyes wide and fixed on that sliver of hallway, straining to see whatever was making its way towards me. The noise continued its deliberate crawl up the staircase, each creak punctuated by an agonizing pause. It reached the very top of the stairs, right outside my bedroom door, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sounds themselves, a heavy, waiting stillness that stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 5 minutes. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet room. I held my breath, every fiber of my being alert, waiting for whatever was on the other side of that slightly open door to reveal itself. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, and summoning a desperate, almost reckless courage, I slowly turned over in my bed. I buried my face deep into my pillow, pressing it against the fabric, trying to force myself back into sleep, to make myself invisible, to somehow conjure away the unseen presence just outside my door. It was a futile attempt, but the only defense I could think of against the paralyzing fear. The next morning, after a fitful, haunted night, I cautiously made my way downstairs. The memory of the sounds, the agonizing wait, was sharp and unsettling. As I entered the kitchen, a new sight awaited me, one that confirmed the reality of the night's events. All the kitchen chairs, which had been neatly tucked under the table, were now inexplicably huddled together in the very middle of the room, as if someone had gathered them in a bizarre, silent meeting. It was a clear, undeniable sign that something had indeed moved through the house while we slept, something that defied all logic and human explanation. Shortly after that incident, we ended up moving out of that house. The cumulative effect of these unsettling occurrences, culminating in the terrifying staircase ascent and the rearranged chairs, had made the house feel less like a home and more like a place constantly shared with an unseen, unsettling presence. Since leaving that house, I haven't experienced anything quite like it again. A fact that only reinforces the chilling memory of that night and the indelible mark it left on my perception of the world. I've had a few experiences with the paranormal, all of them occurring within the confines of the house I lived in as a child. Looking back, there were always subtle things that happened. fleeting cold spots, or the occasional object that seemed to move on its own, but nothing I could truly grasp or definitively remember until I was in high school. That's when the first truly undeniable incident happened, one that seared itself into my memory. It was late one evening, past my usual bedtime. I had just finished saying goodnight to my family, the sounds of their television and conversation fading as I retreated into the quiet of my own room. I closed the door behind me, the familiar click echoing in the stillness, and began to get ready for bed. I changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and then, finally, I lay down in my bed, pulling the covers up. I'd been resting for no more than 5 to 10 minutes, my body beginning to relax, drifting towards the edge of sleep, when I felt it. A distinct pressure, like a handprint pressed against the very edge of my bed near my feet. It was not a heavy weight, but a clear, unmistakable impression, as if someone had firmly placed their palm there. My eyes snapped open. I bolted upright in bed, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs, expecting to see my younger brother standing there, caught in the act of playing a prank. He was known for sneaking into rooms and trying to startle us. However, upon inspection, there was no one there. The space at the foot of my bed was empty. My gaze darted around the room, but it was just as it had been before, undisturbed. Then, from the kitchen, which wasn't too far from my room, I could clearly hear the distinct sound of my little brother's voice, joking and laughing with my mum. There was simply no way he could have snuck out of their presence, crept into my room, touched my bed, and then returned to the kitchen without me noticing, especially since there was a large space between the foot of my bed and the door. The logical impossibility of the situation hit me with a chilling force. A profound wave of terror washed over me. Freaked out, I practically launched myself from my bed, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that unsettling, unseen touch. I bolted from my room, tearing through the hallway and bursting into the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My brother and my mom, who had been laughing moments before, stared at me in bewilderment, their faces a mixture of surprise and concern as I stood there shaking on the verge of hysterics. I attempted to explain what had just happened, words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent rush about the handprint, the empty space, the distinct feeling. But my mum, ever the practical one, simply dismissed it. She told me it was all in my head, that I had probably just imagined it, and instructed me to go back to bed. I felt a deep sense of shame and embarrassment, my face burning. I had no proof, nothing tangible to show them, only the raw, undeniable memory of what I had felt. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that it had not been in my head. It had been real. The isolation of that knowledge, the feeling of not being believed, was almost as unsettling as the experience itself. However, years later, a quiet vindication arrived. Enough people who subsequently lived in or visited that house experienced their own unexplainable things. Fleeting shadows, strange noises, objects moving subtly on their own. These independent accounts, shared years after my own experience, served as a quiet proof, confirming what I had known all along. The house itself held a secret, a presence that touched without being seen. The memory of that unseen handprint, chilling and undeniable, remains etched in my mind, a stark reminder of the thin veil between what we perceive as reality and the mysterious forces that sometimes break through. A couple of years ago, my sister and I found ourselves staying overnight at our mum's house. It was a temporary arrangement, but it meant we both had to bunk together in my sister's old room. She had always hated that room, even as a child, claiming that spooky things used to happen there all the time. But we, being the older, more cynical adults we had become, had always kind of shrugged it off as an overactive imagination, a byproduct of childhood fears. We were both in our early 20s then, well past the age of believing in monsters under the bed, or so we thought. The night wore on, well past midnight, the kind of late hour when the house grew utterly still and the world outside seemed to fall silent. We had been talking for hours, covering everything and anything that came to mind, a comfortable, continuous flow of conversation that often happens during these shared sleepovers. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I started to feel genuinely tired. "Can you turn the light off?" I asked my sister, my voice a soft murmur. "I'm pretty tired and want to sleep." She reached for the switch, and the room plunged into complete darkness. A sudden, heavy blanket. For about 3 minutes, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the quiet settling of the house and the sound of our own breathing. Then, from somewhere indistinct within the room, it came. A sound. It was a super low, rough growling, a guttural noise that vibrated through the air, chilling me to the bone. It wasn't a human sound, nor was it animalistic in any familiar way. It was deeply unsettling, something primal and menacing. The closest description I could ever come up with was the sound the creature from that old horror movie, The Grudge, makes just before it attacks. A truly terrifying, non-human sound. My heart leaped into my throat. I lay there, rigid with fear, barely daring to breathe. "Was that you?" I whispered to my sister, the words barely audible, my voice trembling. "Was that you?" I repeated more urgently, desperate for a human explanation, for anything that could ground me back in reality. "Turn the lights on. Turn the lights on." The demand was desperate, frantic. My sister, equally terrified, fumbled in the darkness for the lamp on the dresser. In her panicked haste, the lamp slid from the dresser and fell to the floor, landing with a soft thud. We were both in full panic mode, 2 grown adults suddenly reduced to terrified children. My sister, her voice strained and a little shaky, let out a nervous laugh. "See?" she said, the words a mix of fright and unsettling triumph. "I told you this room is freaky." She then continued fumbling, finally managing to turn on the light. The sudden illumination felt like a profound relief, pushing back the oppressive darkness that had housed that terrifying growl. We kept the light on for the rest of the night. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by anxious glances towards the darkened corners of the room. We were well into our early 20s, not little kids anymore, a fact that only made the experience more profoundly unsettling. While other freaky things had happened in that room when my sister was younger, and even some that I had experienced myself later, I had always managed to rationalize them away, often putting them down to vivid dreams or an overactive imagination, a sort of self-deception to cope with the inexplicable. But that growl, so sudden and so utterly terrifying, shattered all those convenient explanations. It was a shared experience, a tangible sound that cemented the room's reputation as something truly undeniably haunted. The memory of that low, rough sound, emanating from the very fabric of the darkness, remains etched in my mind, a chilling reminder that some places truly harbor something dark and unseen. A few years ago, a friend of mine, let's call him Mark, was on vacation at his grandfather's place. It was in a truly rural area, basically the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor was kilometers away, meaning the nights were utterly consumed by an intense, overwhelming darkness. Like with many countryside buildings, his grandfather's house didn't have proper indoor plumbing, so the restroom was a small outhouse located just outside the main building. It was about 3 in the morning, the night pitch black, a moonless void broken only by the distant glitter of stars. Mark, needing to use the restroom, grabbed his phone, using its torch function to light his way through the oppressive gloom. He made his way across the short distance, found the outhouse, and did his thing. Just before leaving, a thought occurred to him. He was alone, in complete darkness, in the middle of nowhere. It felt like a moment to capture, a small, adventurous act. He opened the restroom door ajar, just enough to frame the vast, empty void of darkness surrounding him. and decided to take a quick photo with his phone. The idea, he explained later, was to snap a picture for a popular social media app to show all his friends how brave he was, standing alone in the dark countryside. He almost dropped his phone. The image that appeared on the screen, a chilling, immediate playback of what he had just captured, showed that his bravado was misplaced. He wasn't alone. In the picture, there was a strange, almost abstract duel of light and shadow on the left side, an empty void next to it. But as his eyes adjusted, as he stared into the dark, grainy image, something else emerged. It seemed to be a couple, standing, facing the camera, facing him, in the absolute darkness just beyond the outhouse door. The man appeared to be wearing a suit, a dark, formal outline against the deeper black. In front of him, slightly obscuring him, was a woman dressed in a vibrant red dress, a striking burst of color against the monochrome night. They were simply standing there, unmoving, their forms distinct, their gaze seemingly directed towards the phone. Mark was profoundly shaken by the image he'd just taken. The initial shock turned into a cold, creeping fear. He quickly typed a message onto his phone, a frantic command, "Take a screenshot, and hit send to everyone in his contact list, including me, desperate to share what he had just witnessed, perhaps to confirm its reality. All the while, he was trying to muster up the courage, the sheer willpower, to return back to the safety of his grandfather's house, knowing that the figures in the photograph were now just meters away, watching. To this day, we still don't really know what caused it. The explanations we've tried to come up with all fall short. It may, 100%, be an illusion, a trick of light and shadow, just the right angle catching something in a way that suggests human forms. It may also be Photoshop, a digital manipulation, perhaps something Mark did subconsciously, or as a delayed joke, but he hasn't told us it was a joke in all these years. He still recounts the story with a genuine shiver, the terror in his voice palpable. I still have the image saved on my desktop, a digital testament to the inexplicable. And every time I open it, every time I look at those two figures standing silently in the darkness, a cold shiver runs down my spine, a chilling reminder that sometimes the camera captures more than the eye can see. My boyfriend's grandfather is a passionate antique collector, and one of his particular interests revolves around dolls, especially those made of porcelain. His house is filled with them, glass cases displaying their delicate faces and intricate costumes. About 2 weeks ago, he acquired a new addition to his collection. It was a particularly ornate porcelain doll, exquisitely crafted, its eyes wide and vacant. He picked it up from an estate sale, and as he was leaving, the previous owners, 2 older women with solemn faces, had given him a peculiar warning. "Be very careful with it," they said, their voices hushed. "It's special." My boyfriend's grandfather, being largely unfazed by such superstitious remarks, didn't ask any further questions. He simply smiled, thanked them, and brought the doll home with him, placing it initially in the kitchen on a high shelf, a new centerpiece in the bustling heart of the house. For the first 3 days, everything was fine. The doll sat silently in the kitchen, an inert object, blending into the eccentric decor of the house. Nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Then, on the 4th day, the strangeness began. My boyfriend and I were lying in our room, which was down the hall from the kitchen, talking quietly in the late hours. It was around midnight. The house had settled into a comfortable silence, when suddenly 3 distinct, light knocks echoed through our bedroom door. They weren't loud, but they were clear, deliberate, and undeniably present. We looked at each other, our eyes wide. Before either of us could react or question the sound, we heard his grandfather's voice from the other side of the door, calling my boyfriend's name. It was a clear, calm sound, though slightly muffled by the door. I immediately got up, feeling a surge of unease, and opened the door, expecting to be brought face to face with his grandfather, ready for whatever late-night task he had in store for my boyfriend. But no one was there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the nightlight from the bathroom. I stood there for a moment, confused, then closed the door, shrugging it off. Perhaps I had misheard, or he had walked away quickly. But as I closed the door, I could distinctly hear footsteps receding down the hall, light and quick. It sounded like someone was walking away. Yet, in the distance, I could hear both grandparents snoring, a soft, rhythmic sound emanating from their bedroom. It was impossible. The following day, around the same time, the house plunged into darkness. All power to the house was lost. Not just a flicker, but a complete blackout that lasted for hours, not returning until 5 or 6 in the morning. We fumbled for flashlights, lit candles, navigating by their flickering glow. Thankfully, throughout that long, dark night, one small lamp, miraculously, remained on in the living room. I don't know how. It wasn't connected to a generator, and the entire neighborhood was dark. Occasionally it would flicker and go out for a few seconds, only to somehow regain power and illuminate the room again. It was unsettling, another inexplicable anomaly. A few more nights went by without anything happening, a brief period of quiet that almost allowed us to dismiss the previous incidents as isolated oddities. But then, just a few nights ago, the disturbances returned with a terrifying intensity. All through the night we heard screams. Not from inside the house, but from right outside, just beyond the walls. They were shrill, desperate sounds, like someone in profound pain or terror. They were distant enough to be indistinct, but close enough to be horrifyingly real. It was agonizing, lying there, listening to these phantom screams, knowing there was nothing we could do, nothing we could see. Last night, things escalated further. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning. I was lying down, watching videos on my phone, trying to distract myself from the lingering unease of the previous nights. My boyfriend was asleep beside me. Suddenly, he sat straight up in bed, his eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead. He started rambling gibberish, a jumble of incoherent words mixed with random numbers. His voice was strained, unnatural. I immediately asked him what was wrong, my heart pounding. He looked at me, his eyes unfocused, then in a perfectly normal voice said, "I'm okay." Then, without breaking eye contact, his face contorted. He screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound filled with a primal terror that made my blood run cold, and then, just as suddenly, he threw himself back down onto the bed and continued snoring as if nothing had happened, as if he had simply been in a deep, disturbed sleep. I stared at him, my mind reeling. I nudged him, tried to wake him again, but he was completely out, snoring peacefully. I asked him about it earlier today, trying to piece together the terrifying fragments of the night. He had absolutely no memory of it. None at all. It was as if that moment, that scream, had been completely erased from his conscious mind. My boyfriend's grandfather is taking the doll to his antique shop tomorrow. We are all clinging to the hope that once it is out of the house, things will finally go back to normal. We believe, with a desperate certainty, that the doll is the source of all this strange activity, the conduit for whatever malevolent presence has infiltrated our lives. After he took it out of the house and placed it in his antique shop, a subtle but palpable shift occurred. The air in the house, which had felt heavy and charged with an unseen energy, seemed to lighten. But a strange irritability settled over everyone. The usual upbeat, resilient attitude that defined our family, that we can conquer anything spirit, was replaced by a pervasive grumpiness, a quickness to anger, a low-level tension that hummed beneath the surface of every interaction. It was as if the doll, even in its absence, had left a residue, a lingering effect on our emotions. I've also started having a series of incredibly hyper-realistic dreams since the doll arrived. They aren't just dreams, they feel like vivid, terrifying experiences. In one, I was drowning, the water filling my lungs, the panic utterly real. In another, I was burned alive. The searing pain, the smell of smoke, all intensely real. Then there was one where I was pulled apart, limb from limb, a sensation of agonizing tearing. And last night, the most disturbing of all, I was captured. My face, or lack thereof, was horrifying. I didn't have one. There was a tall, shadowy man in the dream, his presence cold and imposing. He forced me to look at my reflection, at my faceless horror. "Look at the beauty I have created," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. It was unnerving, to say the very least. The dreams feel like a continuation of the torment, a psychological assault even when the doll is not physically present. I pray that once the doll is permanently gone from the house and truly out of our lives, this insidious, pervasive influence will finally cease. Last night, I went to spend the night at my girlfriend's apartment. It was late, around 12:30 in the morning by the time I arrived. She was already asleep in her room, so I quietly let myself in, locked the doors behind me, and turned off all the lights, easing into the comfortable darkness. I laid down beside her, and almost immediately I fell asleep, the day's weariness washing over me. Around 1:30 in the morning, we were both kind of half-conscious. My girlfriend had shifted her sleeping position, nudging closer to me, and had given me a soft kiss. Not even a minute or two later, perhaps just seconds, we were both simultaneously and violently woken up. It wasn't a slow awakening, it was a jarring, instantaneous jolt to full awareness, caused by an incredibly loud voice. It emanated from the open door of her closet, a deep, resonant male voice. The specific words were blurred by the shock, but the tone was clear, powerful, and utterly out of place. I remember only the distinct booming sound and the chilling certainty that it was a man's voice. My adrenaline immediately surged, pumping through my veins, my mind instantly snapping into a fight or flight response. I was ready to defend us, ready to confront whatever or whoever was in the apartment with us. Neither of us can remember exactly what was said, only that it was super loud, a commanding, intrusive sound that ripped through the quiet of the night. Honestly, I was scared. Truly, deeply scared. The immediate assumption was that someone had broken into the apartment. I instantly threw my hand over my girlfriend's mouth. She was clearly freaking out, a small choked gasp escaping her, and I knew she thought someone was in the apartment with us as well. I looked at her, my eyes wide with terror, and motioned for her to be quiet, a silent plea for her to remain still. Then, with as much stealth as I could muster, I got up. My heart was pounding, my senses on high alert. I turned on all the lights in the apartment, flooding the space with artificial brightness, hoping to expose the intruder. I systematically searched every single room, every closet, every corner, every place a person could possibly hide. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains, inside the smallest nooks. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. All of the doors were still locked just as I had left them. No signs of forced entry, no disturbed objects. The apartment was empty, save for us and her sleeping dog. After the initial panic subsided, I tried to lay out all the facts to logically debunk what had just happened. I tried to find a rational explanation for the booming voice. I considered the neighbors. You can hear the neighbors throughout the entire building, but only while they're screaming or stomping around, and even then it's always muffled, a distant, indistinct sound coming through the floor or walls. This voice was not muffled. It was clear, distinct, and felt as though it was right inside our room, right by the closet door. The sheer loudness of the voice eliminated the possibility of it being a neighbor. I considered the open window in her room. It was hot in her room, so we had left it ajar to let in some cooler air. But we live in Upper Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and we have a lot of snow. I looked outside, scanning the ground directly beneath the window. There were 0 footprints around the window, No disturbance in the fresh snow that would indicate someone had climbed in or out. That factor was eliminated. Then there was my girlfriend's dog. She was sleeping soundly between my legs when we heard this voice, a warm, furry weight that was completely oblivious. She was dead asleep when I got up to check what the hell it was. Her usually sensitive ears hadn't even twitched. This eliminated the possibility of it being the dog, a sudden bark or growl. Both my girlfriend and I have been pretty bewildered by this encounter. It was so real, so undeniable, yet utterly without a logical explanation. The memory of that voice, so loud, so sudden, so impossible, continues to haunt us. I spent the night there again recently, just a few nights ago. I tried to push the previous experience from my mind, to believe it was a one-off anomaly. We went to sleep, and as usual, I made sure the closet door was fully closed. We had confirmed it was closed before we drifted off. But then I woke up abruptly, not to a sound this time, but to a sensation. I felt someone's hand on my pillow, right next to my face. I could feel the distinct pressure, the weight of it. Though it was unseen, it wasn't a light touch. It was a definite impression, as if a large hand had pressed firmly into the pillow beside my head. The pressure made me wake up, my eyes snapping open. I turned my head slowly, cautiously, to look at the pillow. And there it was. A clear, distinct imprint of what appeared to be a large hand pressed into the pillow next to where my face had been. The indentations of fingers, a palm. As I was observing the pillow, my gaze drifted slightly and I noticed something else. The closet door, which we had confirmed was closed before we went to sleep, was now wide open. Not just ajar, but wide open, revealing the dark interior. And my girlfriend's dog, who was usually curled up at the foot of the bed, was now lying on the floor, directly in front of the open closet, staring intently into its darkness. Her body was rigid, her gaze fixed, as if she were watching something I couldn't see. I don't know what it means. I don't know who or what the hand belonged to, or why the closet door was open, or what the dog was staring at. But I know something is going on. Something is not right in that apartment. It's more than just a strange voice now. It's a physical manifestation, a chilling confirmation that we are not alone. And I need to get to the bottom of it. The apartment, once a place of comfort, has become a source of profound unease, a stage for inexplicable events that whisper of a deeper, darker presence. My grandmother, on my mother's side, was always considered to be our family's eccentric one, the crazy one, as some of the more conservative relatives would whisper. Long before I was born, her marriage to my mother's father had failed, largely, I was told, because my grandmother was far too interested in what his very Catholic family considered witchcraft. She delved into astrology, read tarot cards, and experimented with various spiritual practices. To them, these interests were not harmless hobbies, but dangerous dabblings in the occult, a direct affront to their strict religious beliefs. My grandfather, a man of rigid faith, couldn't reconcile her spiritual curiosities with his upbringing, and their marriage eventually crumbled under the weight of these irreconcilable differences. Growing up, my grandmother used to tell me stories, fantastical tales that filled my young mind with wonder. She spoke of the fairies that lived in her sprawling, overgrown garden, tiny, mischievous beings that danced among the flowers. She would warn me with a twinkle in her eye never to leave my shoes outside at night, for the gnomes might steal them, whisking them away to their underground dwellings. As any child of the 1990s, I was in love with Disney, my imagination shaped by animated classics and whimsical characters. So, all of Grandma's stories, as enchanting as they were, seemed to be just that, stories, delightful fabrications designed to entertain a child. But there were always rules at Grandma's house, and most certainly not your typical ones. Things like, leave the windows open at night so the frogs can come in, a strange invitation to the natural world. Or, Be sure not to step on any of the frogs. A gentle reminder to respect all creatures. If you baked something, you absolutely had to leave a small piece for the fairies, or things would start to go missing, she warned, her eyes serious. These were odd rules, strange rituals, but as a kid, it was all part of the fun, part of the magical world she had built around herself. Now, my grandmother was also a hoarder. For my entire life, she was the type of person who had a narrow, winding trail from one end of her house to the other, a path carved through mountains of possessions. Everything else was stacked floor to ceiling, a labyrinth of forgotten objects. But she never hoarded trash. It was always useful things she was probably never going to use herself, but needed to have just in case. And food. Oh Lord, did that woman hoard food? Her pantry was a testament to every canned good, every dried pasta, every emergency supply imaginable. My grandmother grew up during the Great Depression, constantly having to move around, leaving everything she owned behind each time. Once she grew up and was able to create her own stability, to finally have a permanent home, she started hoarding. My mother says my grandmother started hoarding when my mother was a teen and never stopped. Most of the things she would collect came from Goodwill, flea markets, garage sales, and pretty much unwanted second-hand crap, each item carrying its own silent story. Something else I feel as though I should mention. I am the youngest child of 3. My 2 older siblings are my half-siblings. My sister and I share the same father, and my brother and I share the same mother. My brother was around 4 or 5 when my parents met, meaning I wasn't the first grandchild my grandma had, but I was the only one she seemed to like. My siblings were never invited to her house or really welcome to be there at all. My grandmother treated my siblings as though they didn't exist, her attention and affection entirely withheld from them. Me, on the other hand, she would call my parents constantly, asking when we were going to be in the valley next, and if they would like to bring me to her house to spend the weekend. Neither of my other siblings ever stayed the night at Grandma's house. I was the sole recipient of her peculiar favoritism. I feel as though this information is important as to why I'm making this post, why what happened next felt so significant. I was 13 at the time, still very much caught in my grandmother's orbit. I had spent a weekend with her while my parents were staying at another relative's house not far from there. This arrangement was pretty normal, as stated before. I seemed to be the only family member she truly liked, the one she truly connected with. Well, that weekend, my grandmother gave me a gift. It was a music box that was also a porcelain doll. I collected porcelain dolls, so I didn't think anything of it. The fact that she was giving me a new one, adding to my cherished collection, simply filled me with delight. But as she handed it to me, her grip firm, her eyes fixed on mine, she repeated the warning from the antique sellers. "Take care of him," she said, her voice unusually solemn. "He's very special, and you need to be sure to give him the love and attention he deserves." She then gave me a specific instruction. You need to wind him and play him at least once a month. Okay, I thought, a little confused by the unusual emphasis, but I nodded. Whatever you say, Grandma. Soon after, my mother and her ended up having a serious falling out. The details were never clear to me, just a vague sense of a bitter argument, an irreparable rift. I was told that if I wanted to see her or speak to her, I would have to find my own way of doing so. But as far as my mother was concerned, my grandmother was dead to our family. To this day, I have no idea what their profound falling out was over, just the enduring silence that followed. Now, there's a whole lot that happened between that time, when I was 13, and when I turned 18. My teenage years were marked by a series of unsettling, unexplainable events. The strangest of them all occurred when I was 15. I had to have emergency neck surgery. A mysterious mass had appeared, growing rapidly, and had started cutting off blood flow to my brain. It was a terrifying, life-threatening condition. If I hadn't gone to the hospital for my neck being sawed open, if they hadn't performed that urgent surgery, I could certainly have died. The close call, The inexplicable nature of the mass felt like a dark shadow. Fast forward to Mother's Day 2011. I was 18 years old at the time. Every 4 years or so, my grandmother's birthday would fall on Mother's Day, and it did so on that day. I hadn't talked to her for a few years at that point, not since the big falling out. I wasn't allowed to use the house phone to contact her, and for the longest time, no one would give me her phone number. But on that Mother's Day, an overwhelming urge to connect with her, to bridge the silence, compelled me. I finally got her number from a sympathetic relative and called her. The conversation, even now, is etched in my memory. "Hey, Grandma, it's me," I said, a little hesitant, a little excited. "I just wanted to call you to wish you a happy birthday and Mother's Day. Do you have anything special going on?" Her voice was frail, but filled with an immediate, overwhelming joy. "Oh, goodness. I thought I'd never get to speak to you again. And to my surprise, that damn mother of yours let you call me." "Yeah, sorry I haven't called sooner. But I've really missed you, Grandma. How would you feel about me making a trip up there to see you soon?" I asked, hoping for a reunion, for an end to the silence. "Oh, that would be wonderful," she exclaimed, her voice gaining strength. "We can finally talk about all the things your mother has been hiding from you. She's been lying to you your whole life about who you really are. You need to embrace it. You need to confront your mother and demand she tell you what she's been keeping from you." Her words were a shock, a sudden, dark twist in the conversation. "Oh, okay, Gram," I said, a little stunned. "So, what do you think of me coming to see you soon? I'd really like to catch up with you. I've missed you so much. Do you think you could come to my high school graduation next month?" "Yes, you should definitely come see me," she urged, ignoring my question about the graduation. "Can you come this next weekend?" "No," I replied, a pang of guilt. "I don't think I can, but I'll try." After a very long, unsettling silence, she asked, "Do you still have him?" "Who?" I asked, confused. "The jester," she said, her voice low. "Yeah, I do," I replied, a shiver running down my spine. "The doll, the music box." "Bring him with you," she commanded. "Oh, all right, Grandma," I said, trying to sound casual. "Well, I have to go soon because I'm making dinner tonight, but I love you, and I'll call you again soon." I attempted to call her again a few weeks later to see if she could attend my graduation. She didn't answer. My other phone calls over the next few months were unanswered as well. She died that December, which brings me to the whole point of this post. The doll she gave me. The jester. I've had him for 10 years now, and during that time, I've had a lot of unexplainable experiences. Some I prefer to keep private, too intimate and unsettling to share with just anyone. But I'd be willing to share those more on a one-to-one basis, if they could possibly help. But as far as the noticeable activity that I and my partner have witnessed, here it is. Night terrors. They start if the doll is not in our bedroom or sleeping space. They are the absolute worst I've ever had. Vivid, horrifying nightmares that leave me screaming, covered in sweat, and utterly disoriented. Things go missing. Objects, sometimes important ones, sometimes trivial, will vanish from their usual spots, only to turn up later in places they absolutely should not have been in, places that defy logic and explanation. The doll itself will go through months of sitting alone on a shelf, not being wound or played, forgotten in its silence. But then, without warning, it will constantly play single notes or small parts of its song, a faint, disembodied melody drifting from its porcelain form. It's a quiet, unsettling musical reminder of its presence. And then there's our new dog. He can't stand it. He will wake up from a dead sleep, his body stiff, and immediately start barking and growling like crazy at the doll, his eyes fixed on it, unblinking. I have a video of him doing so, his hackles raised, his posture radiating pure, unadulterated fear. It's a primal, visceral reaction that confirms to me that something is undeniably wrong with that doll. I have battled depression for a long time, And sometimes I think back to when I first started to feel the way I do, the persistent sadness, the pervasive gloom. It was around the time the doll came into my life, around the time I was 13. I wonder if there's a connection, if it feeds on my despair, much like the presence in the Stephenson Island house I spoke about before. I guess what I'm getting at is, I need help figuring out if there really is something going on, or if I'm just crazy, if my mind is playing tricks on me. I need help to bring him, the jester, and myself to peace again. There's a whole lot that I wanted to say, so many details that I haven't been able to, and would be more than willing to talk to someone if they think they can help. And please, don't recommend Sage. You don't think I've tried that? I've exhausted every conventional method. The Jester doll, with its silent, watchful gaze, its phantom music, and its unsettling effects, remains a profound mystery, a link to a past that refuses to be forgotten, and a source of deep, persistent unease. It holds a power, I believe, that is far beyond the reach of simple remedies, a darkness that feels ancient and deeply personal. It was a Tuesday, I think, about a month ago now. The school cafeteria buzzed with the usual cacophony of voices, the clatter of trays, and the faint, sweet scent of lukewarm pizza. My 6 closest friends and I were gathered around our usual lunch table, a spot we'd claimed since middle school, our own little island in the noisy sea. Everything felt ordinary, routine, yet something undeniably felt off. It was subtle at first, a slight tension in the air, mostly centered around Amanda. She sat across from me, her usual vibrant energy dulled, her eyes darting nervously around the room, avoiding direct contact. Her hands fidgeted under the table, a clear sign of distress that only I, perhaps, noticed with such clarity. I had known Amanda since we were small children, and I could read her like an open book. This was not just a bad mood. This was something deeper, something unsettling. The minutes crawled by, each one amplifying my unease. I kept glancing at her, trying to catch her eye to offer a silent question or reassurance. Finally, she leaned across the table, her voice hushed, barely audible above the general din. "I need to tell you something later," she murmured, her gaze still skittering away from mine. My stomach tightened. The immediate thought was, why not now? But I held it back. "It's okay," I told her, trying to keep my voice light, reassuring. "You can tell me anything, you know that. Just tell me now if it's bothering you." Her shoulders slumped a fraction, a visible release of some of the tension she was holding. She took a deep breath, and then, in a rush, the words tumbled out. It went back to late July, a time when the summer heat had been relentless, and the days stretched out, seemingly endless. Amanda had been at a sleepover with another one of our friends, Chloe. Chloe was often easily swayed by trends, by anything that promised a thrill or a peek into the unknown. It had been Chloe's idea, of course, to play with a Ouija board. Amanda, ever the cautious one, usually resisted such things. But that night, boredom, curiosity, and perhaps a desire to fit in had overridden her usual reservations. Now she was looking at me with a desperate plea in her eyes, worried about my reaction. "I played the Ouija board," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "And I'm scared you'll be disappointed. You know, because we're Catholic." A wave of understanding washed over me, mixed with a touch of exasperation. Amanda knew me better than that. I had always been open-minded, even if my own beliefs were rooted in our shared faith. I reached across the table and lightly touched her arm. "It's okay, Amanda," I reiterated, my voice firm but gentle. "Honestly, you can do what you want, believe what you want. I would never, ever judge you for something like that." The relief that flooded her face was almost palpable. She visibly relaxed, some of the color returning to her cheeks. She took another shaky breath, then plunged back into the story, her eyes still holding a hint of lingering fear. "Do you remember when I told you I played it?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. I nodded. "What about it?" I asked. My curiosity piqued despite the chill that was beginning to creep up my spine. I had a vague recollection of her mentioning it, but she had brushed off the details, saying it was nothing, just a silly game. "I didn't really tell you everything," she admitted, her voice dropping again. "What the ghost told us." My heart began to pound a little harder. This was it. This was the reason for the dread. She explained that they had connected with a spirit named Nick. He had died, apparently, from obesity. Amanda said he wasn't malevolent or angry, just present. He had communicated with them, slowly, deliberately, through the planchette. And then he had given them a message. A horrifying, chilling message. "Nick told Chloe and me that I'm going to die before I turn 20, Amanda revealed, her eyes wide, her voice strained. My breath caught in my throat. Before 20? That was only a few years away. My mind immediately raced, trying to process the information, to dismiss it as a cruel joke or a product of their imagination. But Amanda's terror was too real. Then came the next part, the detail that made my blood run cold. He also said I was going to die because I was going to be thrown into a river by a close friend. The cafeteria noise faded into a distant hum. My panic, which had been simmering just below the surface, boiled over. Thrown into a river by a close friend. A terrifying thought, cold and sharp, pierced through me. Could it be me? Was I the friend? My mind raced through our shared history, searching for any hint of betrayal, any dark secret that would explain such a horrifying prophecy. But then Amanda uttered a name and the blood drained from my face. He said it was Becca. My head snapped to the right. Becca sat beside me, engrossed in conversation with our other friends, completely oblivious to the conversation Amanda and I were having. She was laughing, her movements carefree, her attention entirely elsewhere. She looked perfectly normal, a picture of innocence, a beloved member of our group. The contrast between her casual demeanor and the dreadful words Amanda had just spoken was jarring, almost surreal. Was this a sick joke? Was Amanda lying? My mind desperately sought an out, a logical explanation for this nightmare. "Are you lying?" I managed to stammer, my voice tight with fear. Amanda looked at me, her eyes glistening. "No," she whispered, shaking her head vigorously. "I swear it. I'm telling you the truth. I'll put my hand on a Bible right now and swear I'm not lying." Her earnestness was unsettling. Amanda was not one to lie, especially about something so serious, so personal. The sincerity in her voice, the desperate plea for me to believe her, hammered home the terrifying reality of her claim. Then another thought surfaced, a common debunking theory for Ouija board incidents. "Were you or any of our other friends moving the planchette?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It was a desperate attempt to find a rational explanation, to cling to the idea that this was just a trick, a prank, a subconscious movement. "No," she insisted, her head shaking again. "We promised not to move it before we even started. We all agreed. We were so careful." My heart sank. There was no easy out. I had always cautioned Amanda against messing with ghosts or Ouija boards. It was a firm belief of mine that such things invited trouble, opened doors that should remain closed. Now, that old warning echoed in my mind, a chilling premonition of the terror that had just unfolded. The fear I felt was profound, a cold dread that settled in my stomach and spread through my limbs. It was not just for Amanda, but for all of us. If this was real, if this prophecy was true, then our lives, our friendships, were built on a foundation of sand, poised to crumble. To add to the chilling authenticity of the story, Amanda mentioned that Chloe, the other friend who played with them, had confirmed every single detail. I had spoken to Chloe briefly a few days after this conversation, casually bringing up the Ouija board. Chloe had become visibly uncomfortable, her eyes wide, and had quickly changed the subject. But the way she had done it, the palpable unease she radiated, spoke volumes. It was not the reaction of someone who had just played a silly game. It was the reaction of someone who had witnessed something deeply disturbing, something they could not explain and wished to forget. Her confirmation, albeit unspoken, solidified the terror for me. I tried to push the thoughts away, to tell myself it was nonsense, superstition, a product of teenage minds running wild. But the image of Amanda's face, etched with genuine fear, and the unsettling knowledge of Chloe's discomfort, kept the dread alive. How could I reconcile the everyday reality of our lives with this terrifying, seemingly supernatural prophecy? What was I supposed to think? The image of Becca, so close, so familiar, yet now tainted by the chilling words of a supposed ghost, haunted me. Could someone so innocent, so kind, be capable of such a monstrous act? The thought was unbearable, but it lingered, a poisonous seed planted deep in my mind. After that day, the dynamic among our friends shifted, subtly but undeniably. A quiet apprehension settled over our group, a silent awareness of the dark secret that hung in the air. Amanda, though she tried to be normal, carried the weight of the prophecy. I noticed her becoming more withdrawn, more prone to sudden moments of contemplation. Her eyes often distant, as if she was constantly replaying Nick's words in her mind. She would sometimes flinch if someone approached her too suddenly from behind, or if a conversation veered towards the topic of water or rivers. It was heartbreaking to watch. I found myself subtly observing Becca more closely, searching for any hidden darkness, any flicker of malevolence that might confirm the terrifying prediction. It felt wrong, almost a betrayal to scrutinize a friend in such a way, but the fear was a relentless, nagging presence. The school year continued, each day bringing us closer to Amanda's 20th birthday, a looming deadline that felt both impossibly far and terrifyingly near. Every time we passed a river, every time the topic of water sports came up, a cold knot would form in my stomach. The fear wasn't a constant scream, but a low, persistent hum, a background noise to my everyday life. It was a quiet dread, always there, always waiting. I would often lie awake at night, staring into the darkness, my mind replaying the cafeteria scene, the hushed confession, the chilling details. It was hard to believe in such things, harder still to dismiss them entirely when faced with the raw, palpable fear of my friends. This event, so strange and outside the realm of ordinary experience, had fundamentally altered my perception of the world. It had introduced a sliver of the unknown, a dark, unsettling possibility that I could not shake. What if the veil between our world and another was thinner than we imagined? What if seemingly harmless curiosity, like playing with a Ouija board, could invite something truly terrifying into our lives? I had always been someone who sought logical explanations, who believed in the tangible, but this was different. This was a direct, personal encounter with something that defied all logic, all reason. Amanda herself seemed to be living under a shadow. Her laugh was a little less hearty, her smile a little less bright. She tried to live her life as normally as possible, to pretend the prophecy did not exist, but I could see the effort it took. The way she would sometimes pause mid-sentence, her gaze unfocused, lost in some terrifying thought, or the way she would sometimes avoid situations involving water, a subtle but noticeable change in her routine. I never pressed her further on it. The unspoken fear was enough. We all walked on eggshells around the subject, pretending it was just a strange story. Yet privately, we all wondered, we all worried. The fear of what was to come, the fear of the unknown, had become a quiet, persistent companion in our lives, a chilling reminder that some doors once opened might never truly close. The weight of that shared secret, the terror of that dark prediction, cast a long, unsettling shadow over our seemingly normal teenage lives. About 6 years ago, I was living in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where familiar faces were a constant comfort, or sometimes a constant annoyance. My grandmother lived a few miles outside of town, nestled deep in the woods. Her house, a sprawling old structure with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, had once been a place of pure magic in my young mind. It smelled of cinnamon and old wood, and the sound of wind chimes always drifted through the air. But looking back now through the lens of a changed perception, that house was not just old, it was a place of quiet, lingering horror. The memory of it now conjures a cold dread. Her property was vast, covering 100 acres of dense woods. From the house, if you stood on the porch and looked out, there wasn't another house in sight. Just an endless expanse of trees, their branches reaching up like skeletal fingers against the sky. It felt isolated, cut off from the world, a place where secrets could fester undisturbed. There was an old abandoned barn on the property, its weathered wood almost swallowed by ivy, which they used for storing rusty tools and forgotten implements. The rest of the land, however, was untouched, wild and silent. I was just a kid then, somewhere between 1st and 2nd grade, small and impressionable. Every time my sister and I visited, we would sleep in what my grandmother affectionately called the kids' room. It was technically a spare bedroom, but its contents were strictly curated for the younger visitors, and it was these contents that filled me with a quiet, persistent dread. Mounted high on one wall, encased behind glass doors, was a large, ornate wooden display case. Inside, meticulously aligned, were at least 50 dolls. They were vintage dolls, collected by my great-grandmother from every state across the country. Each one was perfectly posed, their porcelain faces gazing straight ahead, their painted eyes seeming to follow my every movement. They had elaborate costumes, stiff lace dresses, tiny bonnets, and delicate shoes, all preserved behind the glass. As a child, I was absolutely petrified of that room. The dolls, with their unblinking stares and fixed smiles, seemed to hold a silent, unnerving power. But my sister and I didn't have much of a choice. It was the only available room for us to sleep in. One night, my sister and I were sharing the large, antique bed in that room. The darkness was absolute, thick and heavy. I woke up suddenly, jolted by some unseen shift in the air. The room was completely black, save for a faint, dim strip of light filtering in from the hallway through the crack under the door. My eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, and then I saw it. One of the glass doors of the display case was ajar, swung open by a few inches, and then, from within the case, one of the dolls, a particularly old-looking one with dark, glassy eyes, began to move. It wasn't a sudden, jerky movement. It was a slow, deliberate shift, as if it were gently adjusting itself within its confined space. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, hoping it was a trick of the light, a lingering fragment of a dream. But the open door, the subtle, unsettling movement, remained. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, burying my face into the pillow, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Another time, I was in the kids' room alone. My sister had gone to bed earlier, exhausted from a long day of playing in the woods, but I couldn't sleep. The memory of what I had seen last time was too fresh, too unsettling. I lay there, staring into the darkness, my eyes wide open, trying to make sense of the shadows that danced on the walls. That's when I noticed it. One of the dolls in the glass case was out of place. All the dolls were mounted securely, their heads fixed forward, their bodies unmoving. But this one, a doll with braided brown hair and a prim blue dress, Its head was facing the glass door of the case, its back to the room. This was profoundly odd. They were meant to look straight forward. They were secured. There was no way it could have moved on its own. As I watched, paralyzed by a creeping dread, the doll's head began to slowly, excruciatingly slowly turn. It rotated on its axis, a silent, deliberate motion. My eyes widened, fixed on the doll. I was off-center in the bed, slightly to the left, so there was no angle, no trick of perspective that could explain what I was seeing. It was undeniably moving. The head continued to turn, its blank, painted eyes eventually coming to rest directly on me. Its gaze felt cold, piercing, as if it could see right through my flimsy blanket and into the core of my fear. I sat there, frozen, sweating bullets under my blanket. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to yell, to scream for my grandma, to run out of that room. But I couldn't. Fear had locked my throat, had turned my limbs to lead. My breath hitched in my chest. The silence in the room, save for the frantic pounding of my own heart, was deafening. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. Eventually, whether from sheer terror or utter exhaustion, I must have passed out. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was look at the display case. All the dolls were facing forward again, perfectly aligned, their heads in their proper positions. The glass doors were closed. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the terrifying encounter of the night had been a waking dream. But I knew what I had seen. The cold sweat, the terror that had gripped me were too real to dismiss. My grandparents have since moved out of that house, finding a new, smaller home in a different town. I believe the dolls are now in storage, tucked away in some forgotten corner, perhaps still retaining their unsettling energy. But my grandparents still own a part of that vast wooded land, using it occasionally for camping trips. The thought of those dolls, those unblinking eyes, tucked away in the darkness, still sends a shiver down my spine. The memories of that room, of the quiet, deliberate movements in the dead of night, remain vividly etched in my mind, a chilling reminder of a childhood horror I could never truly explain. The house now stands empty most of the time, silent in the woods. I wonder sometimes if the presence lingers, if the dolls merely took their energy with them, or if the house itself held something that animated them. I haven't been back to the kids' room since that last terrifying night. I don't think I ever could. The memory of those dozens of eyes, silently watching, waiting, is a burden I carry, a chilling footnote to a childhood that was not always as idyllic as it seemed. The forest around the house always felt ancient too, harboring its own secrets, the way the trees pressed in, creating an enclosed, almost suffocating atmosphere, contributed to the sense of isolation and dread. It was a place where the barrier between the mundane and the deeply unsettling felt thin, almost transparent. The dolls were just one manifestation of that. Even now, years later, when I think of that house, I don't think of warmth or comfort. I think of the cold, still air in that bedroom, the oppressive darkness, and the unblinking porcelain eyes. I think of the slow turn of a doll's head, the deliberate, silent movement that defied all logic and all comfort. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, insidious terror, the kind that creeps into your mind and stays there, festering. The silence was the worst part, the lack of any sound to accompany the impossible. It made it feel more real, more intimate, as if the doll was performing its unsettling act just for me. A private demonstration of the unnerving. I never told my sister about it, not in detail anyway. Some things I learned are too terrifying to share, too unbelievable to articulate, lest you sound mad. So I kept it to myself, a silent burden, a chilling secret from a childhood room that was anything but comforting. My grandmother, a woman approaching 60, found herself in a truly difficult situation. Her health had declined significantly, leaving her in a very fragile state. To compound matters, my aunt, her primary caregiver, had just left for college, leaving my grandmother alone and vulnerable. It was an unspoken crisis, a shared family concern that quickly necessitated a solution. My mother and I, after a series of frantic phone calls and anxious discussions, made the unanimous decision. Grandma had to move in with us. Our home, usually a bustling, chaotic space, would now become her refuge. The process of moving her was exhaustive. We had to pack up decades of her life, sifting through belongings, deciding what to keep and what to put into storage. It was a monumental task, stretching late into the nights. On one particular evening, or rather early morning, we were almost finished. The clock on the old microwave in the kitchen flickered to 2 in the morning, casting a soft green glow in the dim light. My mother and I were on our way back to the house, driving the very last load of my grandmother's possessions, mostly boxes of old photographs and some smaller, sentimental items. As we pulled into the driveway, the sudden, jarring darkness enveloped us. The house lights, which had been a beacon in the night, were out. The entire block was plunged into an inky blackness, a power outage. I looked at my mother, a strange thought bubbling to the surface, one that felt oddly out of place given the circumstances. "Hey, Mom," I said, my voice a little hesitant. "I know this sounds weird, but I kind of wish I had more paranormal experiences in my life." It was a fleeting, whimsical thought, born out of a fascination with ghost stories and the general mystery of the unknown. My mother, tired but amused, just chuckled and muttered something dismissive, probably about how I'd change my mind if I actually had one. Her words were lost in the sudden, eerie silence of the night. We finally made it back inside the now dark house, navigating by the faint glow of our phone flashlights. As we were bringing in the last boxes, I remembered something crucial. My grandmother's cat, a small black creature with piercing green eyes, was still in one of the spare bedrooms, confined to its pet carrier for the journey. I made my way to the door of that room, a soft purr-like murmur escaping my lips as I called the cat's name. I waited for a response, a meow, a gentle rub against the door. Nothing. I knocked gently on the door, a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 trying to coax a sound from the feline. Still nothing. I turned away, assuming the cat was just deeply asleep, or perhaps startled by the move and the dark. But as I took a step away, a sound, distinct and utterly chilling, emanated from inside that darkened room. First, a low, guttural cat hiss, sharp and angry, a sound of profound distress. It was not the gentle greeting I had expected. And then, following immediately after the hiss, came a series of knocks. Not soft, gentle taps, but loud, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. It echoed in the silence of the dark house, a sound that was too rhythmic, too forceful, to be anything but intentional. I am only 15 years old, and I do not normally use profanity, especially not in front of my mother. But in that moment, instinct took over. I ran out of the house screaming at the top of my lungs, a single explosive curse escaping my lips. My mother, who had been just behind me, looked at me, bewildered. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I gasped for breath, pointing a shaking finger back at the house. "I knocked on the room with the cat," I stammered, "and it knocked back." My mother's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding, then dawning horror crossing her face. "That was knocking," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought you dropped something." She had heard it. She had heard the knocks. And she hadn't even been inside the house at that exact moment. She had been just outside the front door, closing up the car. The realization sent another wave of shivers down my spine. The sound was so loud, so clear, that it had traveled through the walls, through the door, and reached her outside. The truly awful part was that I had to go back in. The cat was still in there, terrified and alone. My mother, though clearly shaken, insisted we couldn't leave it. As I hesitated on the front porch, mustering what little courage I had left, both my mother and I heard it again. A sound that defied easy description. It was like when you wake up from a very deep sleep, that guttural, drawn-out groan that escapes your throat as your body reorients itself. A deep, resonant, human-like groan emanating from somewhere inside the darkened house. That was all we needed. We scrambled into the car as fast as humanly possible, our movements clumsy with panic, and sped away from the house, leaving the cat behind for a terrifying few minutes. We drove to a nearby diner, the only place open at that hour, and tried to gather our wits. We called my grandmother the moment we felt composed enough to explain. When we recounted what had happened, her face paled, then settled into a resigned, almost weary expression. "I heard the knocking," she said, her voice quiet. "From that door. Every night, it would wake me up. I always thought someone was trying to break in." A jolt went through me. I remembered now. Weeks ago she had mentioned it, a fleeting comment about strange noises in the night, a sense of unease. I had dismissed it then, attributing it to the creaks of an old house or her imagination. But she had been telling us. She had been trying to warn us. She just hadn't connected it to the specific room or the cat, or perhaps she hadn't wanted to believe it herself. Since that night, I haven't been back to that house. It's been 3 years. The memory of the unexplainable knocks, the angry hiss, and that deep, disembodied groan is etched permanently into my mind. It was a terrifying glimpse into something I couldn't comprehend, a raw, undeniable experience that shattered my youthful skepticism. The house, I am sure, still stands in that quiet neighborhood, carrying its secrets within its walls. But I will never again ask for more paranormal experiences. That one was more than enough. The fear it instilled was too real, too profound, to ever wish for again. I can still remember that day quite vividly, even though it was years ago. It felt like yesterday, the details sharp and unsettling. At the time, I lived in this old, creepy house, a dual-unit Victorian structure that creaked and groaned with every shift in the wind. My older sister and I, over time, had become accustomed to certain peculiarities within its walls. Sometimes, from the corner of our eyes, we would both notice an unexplainable shadow. It was never distinct, never clearly defined, just a fleeting darkening, a shift in the air, a sense of something being there that immediately vanished when we turned to look. We even saw it at the same time on a few occasions, exchanging quick, nervous glances, a silent acknowledgement of the strange. We never let it seriously bother us, though. After all, there was always an adult nearby within earshot, and the shadows were fleeting, easily dismissed as tricks of the light or overactive imaginations. One afternoon, my mum had just picked me up from school. The moment we arrived home, the car barely in the driveway, she turned to me with a slight frown. "Oh, I completely forgot to buy an ingredient for dinner," she said, a sigh escaping her lips. "We need to go to the market." My heart sank. I had other plans, far more pressing in my 6th grade mind. It was a special week-long series of Transformers, and the return of Optimus Prime was about to begin. Missing even a moment felt like a monumental tragedy. "Please, no," I pleaded, trying to sound as reasonable as a 12-year-old could. "I really want to watch Transformers. It's starting right now." I was a big kid now, a 6th grader. I could handle being home alone for a little while. I'd be fine. She looked at me, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, probably weighing my desperate plea against the need for dinner. "Are you sure?" she asked, making sure. "Yes, really," I assured her, my voice rising in urgency. "Besides, we both know our neighbors are home. Our relatives are right next door. I can go there if anything comes up." Our relatives, the Andersons, were always home, always available. My mom still looked a little uncertain, but my persistence, combined with the promise of a nearby adult, seemed to sway her. Before she left, she quickly popped over to the Andersons' house to let them know I was home alone, a quick word through the screen door. Rejoice, free at last. I was the man of the house, even if only for an hour or so. The first thing I did was stride confidently into the kitchen and turn on the old television set that sat on the counter. The familiar opening credits of Transformers filled the small room, a wave of pure joy washing over me. Next, I pulled out my bucket of Lego bricks, dumping them onto the kitchen table. My plan was perfect. Watch Optimus Prime save the world while building some incredible spaceship. I was fully engrossed, my eyes glued to the screen, my fingers nimbly sorting through the colorful plastic pieces. Then, in a moment of clumsy excitement, I fumbled with a small, flat Lego brick. It slipped from my grasp, bouncing off the table and skittering across the linoleum floor, landing just past the doorway in the adjoining hallway. I glanced at it, a tiny dark rectangle against the worn floorboards. I almost went to pick it up, but Optimus Prime was in a particularly dramatic battle scene, and I didn't want to miss a single moment. I decided to ignore it for now. It could wait. About 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. The battle raged on screen, and I was completely absorbed. Then something made me pause, a subtle shift in the air, a feeling. I caught it from the corner of my eye, a faint, unidentifiable shadow right where the Lego piece lay on the floor in the hallway. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough. I felt a prickle of unease, a slight freak out, to the point that the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a prickling sensation that traveled down my arms. But then I reminded myself, it's Transformers. I'm a big kid now. I decided to turn the volume up on the television, a defiant act against the fleeting discomfort. The louder sound, I thought, would drown out any lingering unease. More minutes passed, and I'd completely forgotten about the misplaced Lego. I was fully engrossed in the heroic exploits of Optimus Prime, lost in the vibrant world on the screen. Then suddenly something struck me on the side of the head. It wasn't a hard blow, more like a light tap, but it was entirely unexpected. A small, hard object bounced off my temple, landed on the table with a distinct click-click sound, and then rolled to a stop. It was the Lego piece. My internal alarm system, dormant until now, went off with a jarring intensity. A cold dread settled in my stomach. My head slowly, cautiously, turned towards the hallway, towards the spot where the Lego had been lying. It wasn't there anymore. My heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A draft? A vibration? No. The piece had been on the floor, still, and it had hit me. The click-click as it landed on the table was unmistakable. There was no one else in the house. There was no way that Lego piece could have traveled from the hallway floor across the threshold and directly onto my head, then landed on the table. Screw this, I muttered under my breath, my voice shaky. I'm out. Without another thought, I scrambled off the chair, leaving the Lego and the blaring television behind. I ran straight out of the kitchen, through the living room, and out the front door. A moment later, I was pounding on my neighbor's door, my heart still racing, the terror of the inexplicable fresh in my mind. They opened the door, looking surprised to see me, flushed and breathless. I don't remember what I said exactly, just a jumble of panicked words about the Lego and the feeling, the shadow. They invited me in, their faces shifting from surprise to concern. I stayed there until my mother came home, unable to shake the unsettling feeling of what had just occurred in that old, quiet house. The phantom shadow, the moving Lego, the complete lack of a rational explanation. It was a terrifying realization that some things defy logic and that sometimes you are truly not alone, even when you think you are. The memory of that small plastic brick flying through the air, propelled by an unseen force, remains a vivid and deeply unsettling experience. I had never really been one to delve into paranormal stuff. My life, up until a few months ago, had been pretty grounded in the tangible, the explainable. Not that I hadn't had my share of weird, unexplainable experiences over the years, but I always tried to rationalize them away, to find a logical thread no matter how thin. This past summer, however, my friends and I, in a moment of shared boredom and curiosity, decided it would be a good idea to create our own Ouija board. It wasn't a store-bought fancy one, just a simple piece of printer paper with the letters of the alphabet and numbers written neatly on it, a makeshift portal to the unknown. We chose a coin as our planchette. We started playing at my friend Karen's house, huddled together in her dimly lit living room, our fingers lightly resting on the coin. We began with simple questions, things we knew the answers to, trying to establish a connection, to test the waters. The coin moved slowly at first, then with increasing speed and confidence, spelling out answers that were undeniably correct. It wasn't just random letters. It was coherent, accurate. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I could sense it, a peculiar chill in the air, a prickling sensation on my skin. This felt different. It felt real. Then, a few days later, emboldened by the initial success, we took our homemade board to the old cemetery just outside of town. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old stone, and the silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the trees. It felt like a more appropriate setting, a place where the veil between worlds might truly be thinner. We asked more questions, the coin gliding effortlessly across the paper, spelling out responses with an unnerving precision. It was astonishing the way it moved, almost as if guided by an invisible hand. Then, out of sheer curiosity, my friend Karen, her eyes glinting with a mix of excitement and trepidation, asked a specific question, one that seemed almost too outlandish to consider. "Will our friend Penny be pregnant at age 19? She asked, her voice barely a whisper in the still air of the cemetery. The coin, after a moment of eerie stillness, began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled out a single definitive word, Y-E-S. A collective gasp escaped our lips. It felt absurd, a wild prediction, but the way the coin had moved, the undeniable clarity of the answer sent a shiver down my spine. We folded up the paper, the unsettling feeling lingering long after we left the cemetery. Time, as it always does, marched on. The Ouija board incident faded into the background, becoming a strange, unsettling anecdote we occasionally recalled. Life returned to its normal rhythm. Then, a few months later, the phone rang. It was Penny. Her voice was hesitant, almost disbelieving as she delivered the news. She was pregnant. In that exact moment, hearing those words, I experienced a dizzying mix of emotions. I had never been so awestruck and freaked out at the same time. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Nothing like that had ever worked before. No random prediction from a homemade board had ever materialized in such a startling, undeniable way. The casual game we had played in the cemetery, the bizarre question about Penny, the definitive yes spelled out by an unseen force. It all rushed back to me with a horrifying clarity. I was more than just freaked out. I was genuinely disturbed. The board had worked. It had accurately predicted something so specific, so personal, so utterly improbable. The thought that it had the power to reveal such a detail was insane, unsettling in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. It shattered my skepticism, replacing it with a chilling understanding that there were forces, connections, and forms of knowledge beyond my grasp. A part of me, a small, irrational part, was excited. Excited by the potential, by the idea that there might be more to the universe than I had ever imagined, that other questions we had asked about our futures might also come true. But a much larger, more dominant part of me was incredibly leery of it all. The predictive power of that simple paperboard was not just fascinating, it was terrifying. It meant stepping into a realm of uncertainty, A world where the future was not just a blank slate, but perhaps already written and whispered by unseen entities. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had opened a door we should have left closed, and that the echoes of that opening might continue to ripple through our lives in unpredictable, unsettling ways. The casualness with which we had approached it now felt deeply naive, almost irresponsible. The memory of that chilling prediction and its stunning realization remains with me, a permanent crack in the wall of my rational worldview. My husband and I live in a large house situated deep in the country. Our property backs onto a sprawling open field, and beyond that, stretching as far as the eye can see, lies a vast wheat field, golden and rippling in the summer breeze. We love to take our two pit bulls, energetic and loyal companions, out for long runs in that wide open space. It's a peaceful, isolated existence, though a street does run horizontally from the field's edge, marking the boundary of a very tiny subdivision, almost a handful of houses clustered together in the middle of nowhere. This particular incident happened in June or July of 2014, on a warm, clear night. It was late, around 11 at night. I was sitting on our bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating my book, talking to my mom on the phone. My husband was down the hall, in his study, engrossed in his online gaming. Our master bedroom has two large windows that face out into the backyard, offering a view of the field beyond. Everything was normal. The usual quiet of a country night, the distant chirping of crickets, the low hum of my mother's voice through the phone. Then, without warning, a sound erupted. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. It sounded initially like a plane landing, an impossibly large aircraft descending directly into our backyard, but it didn't sound like a typical plane engine in the slightest. It was a guttural, roaring sound, a deep, mechanical growl that resonated through the very air. It was so incredibly close to the windows, so low to the ground, that the entire house began to shake. The bed vibrated beneath me, the picture frames on the walls rattled, and the glass in the windows hummed with the intense vibration. It was so incredibly loud that I could no longer hear my mum's voice clearly through the phone. Her words were lost in the deafening roar. This sudden, deafening noise absolutely freaked out our cat, a normally unflappable creature. With a terrified yowl, she bolted from her perch at the foot of the bed and disappeared in a flash, seeking refuge under my dresser, a safe, dark hiding spot. I instinctively told my mum to hold on, my heart pounding in my chest. What in the world was making such a monstrous, explosive engine noise? I flung the back door open, desperate to see what colossal thing had just landed in our yard. The moment the door swung wide, the deafening roar abruptly ceased, but it was replaced instantaneously by a different sound, an explosion. A muffled yet powerful, concussive blast that seemed to emanate from the very spot where the noise had just been. Great, I thought, a surge of adrenaline coursing through me. Now, whatever it was, it's exploded. I threw the door open wider, my eyes scanning the darkness of the backyard. Nothing, not a darn thing. The silence that followed was absolute, unnerving. No lingering echoes of the roar, no sounds of debris, no distant sirens. Not a car on the street, not a person, not a plane. Nothing. It was as if the world had suddenly gone mute. My mind, still reeling, scrambled for a rational explanation. An 18-wheeler, perhaps. Maybe it had somehow crashed outside the subdivision, just beyond the field. Perhaps they needed help. I ran around the house into the front yard, my eyes sweeping up and down the horizontal road by the field, looking for any sign of a crash, any flashing lights, any evidence of the catastrophe I had just witnessed. Nothing. The road was empty, bathed in the faint glow of distant streetlights. All noise was gone. I looked up the street next to us as well, hoping to see a neighbor emerge, confused and curious. but no one was there. I was the lone, bewildered individual standing outside at 11 at night, my senses still ringing from the impossible noise. I went back inside, thoroughly unnerved. "Mom," I said into the phone, my voice shaky. "I'll call you back. I'm completely freaked out. I just heard what sounded like World War III happening, and there's no explanation for where it came from." I hung up, my hand trembling slightly. I then walked down the hall to my husband's study, my mind still racing. "Did you hear anything?" I asked, my voice hushed. He looked up from his gaming screen, his headphones still on. "I felt the house shake a bit," he replied casually, "but I had my headphones on, so I didn't hear a thing." Apparently even Castiel, our pit bull, who usually barked at the slightest rustle of a leaf, hadn't heard anything. She hadn't barked, hadn't stirred from her comfortable spot on the rug. How could a noise so loud, so concussive, have gone unnoticed by everyone else, especially by a dog with acute hearing? It was baffling, infuriating, and deeply unsettling. I hope I've explained this well enough, because to this day, I desperately want to know what I heard. The noises had to have come from somewhere, right? An engine, an explosion, a house-shaking vibration. It couldn't have been nothing. I still cannot understand how our neighbors, whose houses were not that far behind ours, didn't come barreling out of their homes, looking around for the source of the sounds, just as I had. It felt like I was the only witness to a private, inexplicable event. Any insight, any theory would be incredibly appreciated, because the memory of that night, of the impossible roar and the deafening silence that followed, continues to haunt me. It was a terrifying realization of how little we truly understand about the world around us and how vulnerable we are to the unexplainable. I was 16 years old, full of teenage boredom, when I found myself at my girlfriend's cousin's place. The cousin, a lively and curious person, always had a new idea for entertainment, and that day was no different. My girlfriend, her cousin, and her cousin's friend were all 100% Thai. I'm only half Thai, but I was well aware that Thai people are, generally speaking, a very superstitious bunch. Spirits, rituals, omens, these concepts are deeply woven into their culture. Perhaps it was this cultural backdrop, combined with our youthful curiosity, that led us down the path we chose that afternoon. Someone suggested we make a Ouija board. We didn't have a store-bought one, of course, so we improvised. We simply took a large piece of printer paper and meticulously wrote out the letters of the alphabet in a semicircle, along with the numbers 0 through 9. We added yes and no in opposing corners and an exit in the bottom center. For our planchette, we used a small, smooth coin. To set the mood, or perhaps to invite something more, we decided to light candles, placing them around our makeshift board. Then, with a mixture of nervous excitement and feigned bravado, we politely asked any spirits to join us. What happened next was genuinely freaky. The coin under our fingertips seemed to move with a will of its own. It glided across the paper, spelling out names of future boyfriends and girlfriends, answers to questions about school, and other trivial teenage concerns. It moved so quickly, so accurately, that it was easy for me to blame Joey, the most excitable and mischievous of the bunch, for manipulating the coin. I kept a close eye on his hand, trying to catch any subtle push, any deliberate movement. But try as I might, I couldn't definitively say he was doing it. The coin seemed to have a life of its own, independent of our conscious efforts. To put our suspicions and our belief to the test, we decided on a new rule for our experiment. My girlfriend, who was usually the most skeptical among us, volunteered to be the sole point of contact. Only her index finger would rest lightly on the coin. The rest of us would just touch her elbow, ensuring no one else could directly influence the coin's movement. To further remove any possibility of conscious manipulation, we asked her to close her eyes and look up, away from the board, keeping her gaze fixed on the ceiling. This way, she couldn't see where the coin was going, eliminating any subconscious guidance. We began to ask a couple of questions designed to be unanswerable by mere chance. We waited, our breaths held, the silence in the room thick with anticipation. The coin remained motionless. No response. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but the coin stayed still. After a few agonizing minutes, a sense of disappointment began to settle in. Perhaps it was all just a game after all, a figment of our collective imagination. Then, we decided to ask our final question, a simple, yet profoundly significant one. "Is anyone here?" my girlfriend asked, her eyes still closed, her finger resting lightly on the coin. The words had barely left her lips when a piercing scream tore from her throat. It was a raw, visceral sound, a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. We all jumped away from the board, startled and horrified, scrambling back from the table. We looked at her, our faces pale with shock. She was crying, silent tears streaming down her cheeks, her eyes still tightly closed, her face still tilted towards the ceiling. But the coin, under her single finger, was moving. It was spelling out a word, slowly, deliberately. S-T-O-P. The single word seemed to echo in the room, chilling us to the core. Her body was rigid, trembling, yet her finger remained on the coin, seemingly glued to it. The coin continued to spell, then moved erratically for a few more seconds, the word "stop" repeated over and over, before finally, mercifully, it stopped. Her finger lifted, as if released from an invisible grip. We stared at each other, stunned and speechless. The candles flickered. The air suddenly felt heavy. Without a word, a silent, unspoken agreement passing between us, we grabbed the piece of paper, tore it into tiny fragments, and flushed it down the toilet, as if trying to erase the terrifying encounter from existence. We then sat there, in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My girlfriend, still shaking, finally spoke. Her voice was strained, hoarse. She said she had absolutely no control over her body. She had wanted to look down, to see what the coin was spelling, to pull her hand away from the board, to jump up and run. But she couldn't. It was as if an invisible force had held her captive, her own will utterly overridden. She had been a spectator to her own terrifying experience, unable to intervene, unable to break free. I will never forget that night. It was a profound, undeniable encounter with the unknown. My skepticism, once a comforting shield, shattered into a million pieces. From that moment on, I've been convinced that there is more to this world than meets the eye, that unseen forces and inexplicable phenomena exist beyond our comprehension. The memory of that scream, of the single word "stop" spelled by an unseen hand, remains a chilling reminder of the delicate line between curiosity and profound, terrifying reality. It was a lesson learned in the most terrifying way imaginable, a lesson that permanently altered my perception of the world around me.